Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. Camping alone was my way of unwinding. A break from the noise of the city, from people, from everything. The isolation of the deep woods was something I craved, until the night it all went wrong. I had set up camp in a remote part of the Timberlake Forest, an area rarely visited even by seasoned hikers. The place was miles from the nearest trailhead, surrounded by thick pine trees that stretched endlessly into the horizon. I pitched my tent by a small clearing, where a creek's soft gurgle provided the perfect soundtrack for a peaceful night. Or so I thought. As the sun began to set, the forest changed. The pleasant chirping of birds was replaced by an oppressive silence. It felt unnatural, as if something had muted the world around me. I shrugged it off. Just the isolation getting to me, I told myself. But as the sky darkened, that silence felt heavier, like it was pushing down on me. I tried to distract myself by lighting a fire. The crackle of the flames helped, filling the quiet with something familiar. As I sat sipping on a cup of instant coffee, I noticed something strange. A faint whispering sound carried on the breeze. It was so subtle I almost didn't hear it. I paused, listening closely. It came again, drifting between the trees, voices too faint to make out the words. My first thought was that other campers were nearby, but I hadn't seen anyone on the way in. Besides, it didn't sound like conversation, it was more like chanting. A chill crept down my spine. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the forest, trying to pinpoint the source. But the light barely penetrated the darkness, only illuminating the twisted branches of the pines and the undergrowth. The whispering stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then there was a sharp, high-pitched whine, a sound like a tree being strained to the breaking point. It reverberated through the woods, unnerving and unnatural. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Deciding to take a look around, I grabbed my knife and my flashlight and ventured away from the campsite. The deeper I walked into the woods, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks gnarled and warped in ways I hadn't noticed before. I could still hear the creek behind me, but it sounded further away than it should have been. Suddenly the whispering returned, louder now, and this time it seemed to be coming from all directions. My pulse quickened and I tried to focus, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. A figure stood among the pines, tall and thin, almost skeletal. It was draped in a tattered cloak of shadows, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the forest. It was unnaturally still, watching me from a distance. My breath hitched and I instinctively stepped back, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The figure moved, not walking but gliding like a shadow slipping between the trees. As it approached, I noticed something worse. It wasn't alone. Several more figures emerged, their shapes distorted, their eyes glowing faintly like embers in the dark. They surrounded me, their whispers growing louder and more frantic, as if they were speaking a language I couldn't understand. The chant swelled, and my head began to spin. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, desperately trying to get back to the campsite. The figures followed, their whispers echoing in my mind, no longer just sounds but thoughts. Dark, invasive thoughts telling me to give in, to surrender to the forest. I burst through the clearing and into my campsite, stumbling to a halt near the fire. It had nearly burned out, leaving only faintly glowing embers. My flashlight flickered as the batteries died, plunging me into near-total darkness. The whispering seemed to surround the clearing, a constant hiss that never stopped. I grabbed my pack, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. But in the darkness I wasn't sure if I could find my way back to the trail. Before I could make a decision, the trees around me seemed to shift, as if the forest itself was closing in. The figures appeared again, just beyond the firelight. Their eyes, those faintly glowing embers, stared at me, unblinking. That's when I heard it, something large moving through the trees, a heavy, deliberate sound different from the whispering figures. It was coming closer, and I could feel the weight of its presence, like the air itself had thickened. A shape emerged from the forest, towering over the others. It was immense, easily 9 or 10 feet tall, its body hunched and covered in matted fur. Its face was a grotesque blend of animal and human, with long pointed ears and eyes that shone brighter than the others. Its mouth curled into a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I realized what it was, a creature I had only heard about in whispered legends, the Dog Man. The figures around me retreated, as if they feared the beast. The Dogman's gaze locked onto mine, and I was paralyzed, unable to move. It let out a low, guttural growl, the sound vibrating through my bones. The creature stepped forward, and I felt the overwhelming urge to flee, but my legs wouldn't respond. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me. I spun around to see another park ranger. Where the hell had he come from? His face was shadowed, and he didn't seem afraid. "You need to leave, now," he said, his voice steady, but there was something off about him. Before I could ask who he was, the Dogman let out a deafening roar, and I bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't care where the trail was. I just ran. By some miracle, I made it to my car. I drove all night, not stopping until I was far from those cursed woods. But something still haunts me. That park ranger, there was something familiar about him. When I reported the incident the next day, they told me no other ranger had been on duty in that section of the park. And the whispers? They followed me for days after I left, always just on the edge of my hearing. Now every time I'm alone, I can feel them, the figures watching, the Dogman lurking, waiting for me to return to the forest. And the whispers, they're getting louder. When my girlfriend Lily and I decided to go camping in Pine Hollow Forest, it was supposed to be a much-needed getaway from the city. We loved the outdoors, and this was our first time camping alone together. Just the two of us. No phones, no other people, just nature. The forest was supposed to be beautiful this time of year. Endless pines, crisp air, a view of the stars like you wouldn't believe. But as we arrived and drove deeper into Pine Hollow, there was something strange about the place. It felt ancient. The pines were so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground, creating deep shadows that stretched across the forest floor like claws. And despite it being prime camping season, we didn't see a single other car on the road. It was as if we were driving straight into a forgotten world. "See, we've got the whole place to ourselves," I said, trying to mask my unease as excitement. Lily smiled, but I could see it in her eyes too, the apprehension. We found a spot to park and hiked for a few miles, lugging our gear until we found a clearing to set up camp. It was a decent spot, a bit overgrown, sure, but secluded and with just enough room for our tent and a campfire. We pitched the tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. By the time the sun was going down, we were already cooking dinner over the flames, laughing about our busy lives and looking forward to a weekend without distractions. As night fell, we sat side by side, the fire dancing before us. The darkness beyond our campsite was complete, the pines forming a solid wall of black. It felt like we were alone on some remote planet, cut off from everything. And then we heard it. A crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. We both froze. The sound had come from the trees, just outside the circle of light cast by the fire. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound convincing. But as I said it, we heard it again, another crack followed by a low rustling sound. This time it was closer, circling the edge of the light. "Maybe we should check it out?" Lily suggested, but her voice wavered, and I could tell she didn't really want to. Neither did I. But I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it toward the sound. The light cut through the dark like a blade, but all it showed were thick pines and brambles. "Nothing," I said, though my voice didn't carry any real confidence. We sat back down, closer together now, and tried to ignore it. The noise died down, but then came another. A low whistle, slow, almost tuneless, like someone was blowing through their lips in a long, shaky breath. The sound made my skin crawl, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. "Is that someone whistling?" Lily whispered, gripping my arm. "It's just the wind," I said, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. There was something human about the sound, and yet not quite right. We tried to brush it off, but the whistling continued, rising and falling, circling us like a predator toying with its prey. And then, something new. A voice, faint and distant at first, like a whisper on the breeze, but as the minutes passed, it grew louder. "Help me, please." It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading. Lily and I stared at each other, eyes wide with fear. The voice echoed through the trees, sounding like it was just beyond the light of our fire, yet at the same time, impossibly far away. "What do we do?" Lily asked, panic creeping into her voice. "What if someone's hurt?" "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight. I was terrified, but if someone really needed help, I couldn't just ignore it. I walked to the edge of the clearing, shining the light into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. "Where are you?" "Help, please." The voice came again, closer this time, like it was right in front of me. But there was no one there, just darkness, and that terrible, endless wall of pines. "Let's go back to the car," Lily said from behind me, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." I couldn't agree more. We quickly packed up our things, shoving everything haphazardly into our bags. The voice continued to call out, getting louder, more frantic. "Help, please. I'm lost." As we were stuffing the tent into its bag, I realized something chilling. The voice. It sounded exactly like Lily's. Not just a woman's voice, but hers. Like an echo of her calling for help, but distorted, twisted. "Lily," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you hear that? It sounds like me," she finished, her face pale, eyes wide. "It sounds exactly like me." We both stood there, paralyzed by fear, and that's when we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush, coming from the direction of the voice. I spun around, aiming the flashlight toward the sound, and for a moment I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing between the pines. I could barely make out its face, but what I did see made my stomach drop. It looked like Lily, or at least it was trying to. The features were there, but stretched and elongated, like a mask made of rubber pulled too tight over a wooden frame. The eyes were black, empty pits, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural smile. It was wearing clothes like hers, but they were all wrong, like they'd been stitched together in a rush, and it just stood there, staring at me with that sickening smile. "Help me," it said, in that voice that was almost Lily's. But the voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from all around us, from the trees, from the air, as if the forest itself were speaking. I grabbed Lily's hand and we ran. We didn't care about the gear, about the food, about anything except getting the hell out of those woods. The whole time, as we stumbled through the darkness, tripping over roots and tearing through thorn bushes, I could hear it behind us. The footsteps, the voice. "Help me, please, I'm lost." We didn't stop until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. We threw ourselves inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, the tires spinning on the dirt road as we sped away. When we got to the nearest town, we told the local ranger what happened. He just stared at us, a look of concern and something else, something like fear, crossing his face. "You said you were in Pine Hollow?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Do you know what that thing was?" The ranger was quiet for a long moment, then finally shook his head. "Pine Hollow's not a place people go anymore. Not since the disappearances. A few years back, some hikers vanished without a trace. Locals say the forest has something out there, something that doesn't want you to leave once you found it." He gave me a sympathetic smile, but his eyes said he believed every word. "You two are lucky to be alive." We drove back to the city in silence, neither of us speaking a word. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. That voice calling to me, soft and pleading. "Help me. Please. I'm lost." And every time I hear it, I know it's still out there, somewhere in those endless black pines. And it's calling my name now, too. I've worked as a park ranger for 5 years, patrolling a vast stretch of dense forest in the Pacific Northwest. I'm used to the solitude, the sounds of nature, the occasional lost hiker. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during one late fall night, something I can barely comprehend, let alone explain. It started out like any other evening. My shift had me stationed near the Timberlake campsite, a remote area accessible only by a narrow dirt road. A group of campers had checked in that afternoon, and I was tasked with keeping an eye on things. As night fell, the woods became eerily silent, with only the occasional crackle of a fire in the distance reminding me that I wasn't completely alone. Around 10 p.m., I decided to take a walk through the woods, flashlight in hand. The towering pines loomed over me like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The trail was familiar, yet there was something off. The usual nocturnal sounds, chirping insects, hooting owls, had faded. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more suffocating the silence became. I stopped for a moment listening. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. But I knew better. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the inky darkness. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. No response, just the heavy rustling of leaves, almost as if something was circling me, hidden just beyond the trees. I forced myself to move forward, my grip tightening on the flashlight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The growl came again, this time louder and closer, echoing in the stillness. My pulse quickened. Whatever was making that noise wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered. Suddenly a sharp snap, a branch breaking behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing, just more trees, more shadow. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I scanned the woods, my flashlight flickered. The beam sputtered, dimmed, and finally died, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my radio, but before I could get it out, something crashed through the underbrush ahead. My eyes strained against the black, and that's when I saw it. 2 glowing, yellow eyes staring back at me from between the trees. They blinked slowly, the creature staying perfectly still. I was frozen, my mind unable to process what I was looking at. Those eyes were too high off the ground for a wolf, and the shape, hulking, distorted, was all wrong for a bear. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the creature stepped forward, its massive form emerging from the shadows. It was a towering, hunched figure, its limbs elongated and twisted unnaturally. The skin or fur, whatever it had, looked mangy, sickly, and it reeked of decay. I backed up slowly, my hands trembling, but it followed, closing the distance between us with unsettling ease. As it drew closer, I could make out more details. Long, clawed hands, a snout like that of a dog, but grotesque, wrong. The creature let out a low, rattling breath, and I realized it wasn't just watching me. It was studying me. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life, breaking the silence with a burst of static. "Ranger Smith, are you there? We've got reports of—" The voice was cut off as the creature lunged. I bolted, crashing through the trees, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind me, I heard the thing give chase, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare look back. The sound of its growling breath grew closer, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually the growls faded. I found myself near the camper's site, gasping for breath. The group was still gathered around the fire, laughing, completely unaware of the nightmare lurking just beyond the tree line. "Something's out there," I shouted, my voice ragged, but they just stared at me, confused. Before I could explain, I heard a noise. Footsteps, but not from the creature. A figure emerged from the woods, another park ranger, but something about him was off. His uniform looked worn, old. His face was obscured by shadow, and when he spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "Not tonight." I blinked in confusion. Who are you?" "I've been here a long time," he replied, stepping closer. His eyes, they were the same sickly yellow as the creature's. "You've seen too much. Time to go." Before I could react, everything went black. I woke up the next morning in my cabin, drenched in sweat. My radio was on the floor, and the door was locked from the inside. No sign of a struggle, no claw marks, no tracks outside. It was as if nothing had happened. But when I checked in with the other rangers, they told me something chilling. There haven't been campers at Timberlake in over a year. The area's been closed off after several disappearances. And that ranger, he died decades ago. Now, every time I go into the woods, I can feel it, that thing, watching me from the trees, waiting. I don't know what's real anymore. Was it all a hallucination, a nightmare? Or is there something far worse lurking in the deep, dark woods? Whatever it is, I'm not sure I'll survive if it finds me again. The forest never forgets, and neither will I. I never wanted to go on the trip. My buddy Jason practically dragged me out there. "Dude, it'll be fun," he'd said. "Just a weekend in the mountains, a few beers, a couple of trails. We need this." And I'll admit, maybe I did need to get away from the grind, from the same four walls and flickering screen every day. But when we reached the Blackwater Ridge Trail, and I saw how thick the trees were, how they choked out the sun like fingers reaching from below, my instincts screamed at me to turn around. I should have listened. The first day went like any other camping trip. Long hike, bad jokes, a lot of swearing while setting up the tent. But the trail was rugged, more overgrown than I expected. Half the time we couldn't even find the markers, so we just pushed through the brush, hoping we were heading the right way. By dusk, we finally set up camp on a small, flat clearing, but everything around us felt off. The woods were silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but a dead, muffled quiet that pressed in on all sides. No chirping birds, no rustling critters. Just the stillness of the trees standing like soldiers around us. We both felt it, though neither of us said anything. We just sat there, passing around a flask of whiskey to warm up as the cold mountain air set in. I don't know why, but that night we kept the fire burning bigger than normal, like we needed it to ward off the dark. Around midnight we heard a noise, a low, rhythmic knocking. Not like woodpeckers, and not like any animal I'd ever heard. Just knock, knock, knock. A steady thumping in the distance. Jason figured it was just trees creaking in the wind, but there was no wind, not even the barest of breezes. It was hard to sleep after that, but exhaustion eventually overtook us. I woke up a few times in the night, feeling like something was watching us from the tree line. But every time I sat up and peered into the darkness, there was nothing, just black, endless black. The next day we went further up the trail, hoping to reach the summit by dusk. But the deeper we went, the harder it was to tell if we were still on the path. The trail markers were sporadic, the way ahead tangled with thorny vines and dense underbrush. At one point, Jason found what he swore was an old marker, a wooden post, carved with strange symbols, faded from age. But the more I looked at it, the less it looked like a trail marker and more like something else, something ritualistic. By the time we set up camp that night, I was on edge. Jason was more relaxed, cooking up some sausages over the fire, joking about how we'd probably get lost and have to live off the land. But as the fire crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then I saw it, movement just outside the light of the fire. A figure, tall and gaunt, just barely visible in the shadows. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Jason, my voice trembling. He followed my gaze but saw nothing. "It's your nerves, man. You're freaking yourself out." But I knew what I saw. Someone, or something, was watching us. The knocking started again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. The same steady rhythm, but closer. Jason, trying to lighten the mood, yelled into the woods, "Hey, if you're going to join us, at least bring some marshmallows." But his voice seemed to die in the silence, swallowed up by the trees. We both fell quiet after that, just listening, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Then we heard it. Not a knock this time, but a voice calling from the darkness, soft and plaintive, like a child lost in the woods. "Help, please, help me." The words hung in the air, dripping with fear. Jason and I exchanged glances. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his bravado gone. "Yeah," I replied, barely able to get the word out. "But it's gotta be a trick or something, right?" Jason grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "What if it's real? What if someone's actually hurt out there?" He shone the beam into the trees, the light cutting through the black, but revealing nothing. "Hey," he shouted. "Where are you?" The voice called back, "Please, I'm lost. Come find me." Against my better judgment, we grabbed our gear and followed the voice. We had to at least see if someone needed help, right? It was human nature. But the further we went from the fire, the harder it became to find our way. The voice led us deeper, always just out of sight. And the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees crowding together, the air thick and stifling. And then the flashlight flickered out. Jason cursed, banging it against his hand to get it working again. For a split second we were in total darkness, and that's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. Cold, clammy fingers digging into my skin. I spun around, but no one was there. "Jason, did you just touch me?" I hissed. "No, I'm right here," he said, but his voice was shaky. What the hell was that? When the flashlight came back on, we found ourselves surrounded by trees, but something was wrong. They were marked, carved with the same strange symbols from the wooden post. All around us, dozens of trees, each one with deep, jagged carvings spiraling up their trunks. It was like we'd stumbled into some ancient ritual site, forgotten by time. "Let's get back to camp," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We turned to go back, but no matter which way we went, it felt like the trees were changing, shifting. The path we'd taken moments ago was gone, swallowed up by the forest. And that's when we heard the voice again. But this time, it was different. "Help me," it whimpered. "I'm so hungry." And then it laughed, a high-pitched cackling laugh that echoed through the trees, bouncing from one trunk to another, until it felt like it was coming from all around us. Jason started running, and I followed, desperate to get back to the camp, back to the fire. We ran for what felt like hours, until we finally broke through the trees and into the clearing. But something was wrong. The campsite. It looked abandoned. Our gear was scattered, the fire nothing but smoldering ashes, and our tent lay in tatters like something had clawed its way through the fabric. And then in the middle of the clearing we saw it, a figure crouched over the dying fire, its back to us, its limbs too long, too thin, and it was wearing Jason's jacket. "Hey!" Jason yelled, and the thing turned around slowly, too slowly, its neck twisting at an unnatural angle, and that's when we saw its face. It was Jason's face, pale, distorted, like a mask stretched too tightly over a skull. The eyes were all wrong, black and empty, staring at us with a hunger that made my stomach turn. And it smiled. A wide, gaping grin that split the face from ear to ear. Then it spoke, in Jason's voice, but wrong, garbled, like it was learning how to use the words. "Help me. I'm lost. Come find me." Jason screamed and bolted, and I followed, sprinting blindly through the forest, running until my legs burned and my lungs screamed for air. I don't remember how we made it out of those woods, but we did, collapsing into Jason's truck and peeling out of there, not stopping until we were miles away. The park rangers never found our campsite. They said we must have gotten turned around, ended up somewhere off the official trails. The Blackwater Ridge is a dangerous place, they warned. People go missing there all the time. But we knew what we'd seen, and sometimes late at night I hear it. That voice, whispering just outside my window. Help me. Please. I'm lost. And I know it's still out there, somewhere in those dark woods, waiting. I used to love hiking alone. Being out in nature, surrounded by the vast silence of the woods, brought me a peace I couldn't find anywhere else. That all changed last year when I took a trip to the Black Ridge Forest. I'd been there a few times before, but I'd never gone as deep as I planned to that weekend. There was a remote trail I'd read about on a hiker's blog, the kind that isn't on the official map, barely known to anyone except the most experienced outdoorsman. I knew the risk of going alone, but I was confident in my skills. Overconfident, as it turns out. I set out on a Friday afternoon, hoping to reach an old ranger's outpost where I could camp for the night. The path wasn't well marked, and it quickly became clear that this trail was as isolated as I'd heard. As I trekked deeper into the woods, the trees thickened, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that swallowed the daylight. The air smelled earthy and damp, and the silence was near complete, except for the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional caw of a crow. But there was something else too, a kind of pressure in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves and the excitement of finding a new place. By the time I reached the outpost, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The structure was little more than a dilapidated cabin, an old wooden shack with a sagging roof and windows that had long since shattered, but it was shelter, and that was all I needed. I set up my sleeping bag inside, lit a small fire in the rusted stove, and settled in for the night. That's when the fog rolled in. It started slowly, seeping in between the trees like tendrils of smoke, and soon it was everywhere, thick and white, clinging to the ground like a living thing. The air grew cold, and an unsettling quiet fell over the forest. No wind, no rustling leaves, no night sounds. Just silence and that thick, suffocating fog. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just a natural weather pattern, but then I heard it, the sound that still haunts me. It was a low humming noise coming from deep within the forest, like a deep voice reverberating through a tunnel. It was rhythmic, like chanting, but distorted, as if it were coming from underwater. And it was getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the cabin door, stepping outside to see if I could spot anything. The beam of light barely cut through the dense fog, and I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. But I heard it, the humming, clearer now, resonating in the back of my skull. It felt like it was coming from all directions at once, wrapping around me like the fog itself. Then I saw movement, a shadow in the mist. It was human-shaped, but there was something wrong about it. The figure seemed to shimmer and bend as though the fog was twisting around it, distorting it. I called out, "Hello?" But my voice sounded small, swallowed by the fog. The shadow stopped, and I felt its eyes, though I couldn't see them, lock onto me. I backed up toward the cabin, trying to keep my flashlight trained on the figure. But then it started moving, quick and smooth, gliding through the fog like it wasn't even touching the ground. That's when I realized it wasn't one figure, it was many, dozens of them shifting and flickering in and out of view like phantoms, circling around the cabin. I slammed the door shut, locking it and retreating to the corner of the room, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I tried to rationalize it. It's just the fog, it's playing tricks on you. But deep down I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The humming grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the walls of the cabin. And then, slowly, it changed. It became whispering. Dozens of voices whispering in unison, low and unintelligible, like a language I'd never heard before. I could feel them, those voices reaching into my mind, burrowing deep, making it hard to think. And then they spoke to me, clear as day. "Come outside." I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the whispering grew louder, almost frantic, a cacophony of voices all saying the same thing, over and over again. "Come outside, come outside, come outside." The doorknob rattled and I felt a cold dread wash over me. I held my breath, flashlight trained on the door as the rattling grew more violent. Then it stopped. Silence again, except for the sound of my own panicked breathing, and then tapping. Soft at first, like fingers gently brushing against wood. But it wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from the window. And then another tap, from the opposite side of the cabin, and another, tapping from all around like they were closing in, surrounding me. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, trying to get it to stay on. And that's when I saw it. The shadow was inside the cabin. It stood at the edge of the beam, tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its face hidden in darkness. The shadow seemed to twist around it like it was made of the fog itself. And the humming, it was coming from that thing. "Come outside," the voice whispered, but this time it was different. It was my voice, my own voice calling to me from the dark. I shut my eyes tight, pressing my hands over my ears to block out the whispers. I don't know how long I stayed like that, seconds, minutes, but when I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone. The fog had thinned and the tapping had stopped. I rushed outside, frantically packing up my gear, not even bothering to fold the tent. I just needed to get away, to get out of that forest. I ran, barely able to see the trail through the thinning fog, adrenaline fueling me as I bolted through the trees. I kept going until I reached my car, threw my stuff in, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles from the forest that I finally stopped, panting and drenched in sweat, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I never went back to Black Ridge Forest after that. I tried looking up stories, searching for anything that could explain what happened, but I found nothing. No mention of the fog, no stories of shadows. But sometimes when I'm alone in my room at night, I hear it. That low, rhythmic humming just on the edge of my hearing. And when I do, I know one thing for sure. It found me. And it's waiting for me to come back. When I set off on the camping trip, I just wanted to escape. I had no idea it would turn into a fight for my sanity and my life. I'd been going through a rough patch, work stress, relationship drama, the usual stuff that piles up until you feel like you're suffocating. A solo trip to the deep woods seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. No phones, no emails, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the whisper of the wind in the pines. I picked a place well off the beaten path, far enough away from civilization to feel truly alone. Or so I thought. The first day went as planned. I hiked for miles, feeling the tension slowly melt away with each step deeper into the wilderness. By the time I found a flat, secluded spot to set up my tent, I was miles away from the nearest road. It was peaceful out there, with only the sound of my own movements and the occasional rustling of the forest creatures going about their lives. I set up camp, gathered some firewood, and prepared for a night under the stars. But it wasn't until the sun dipped below the tree line that I felt something shift. It's hard to describe, but it was as if the woods themselves had changed. The trees that had seemed so inviting in the light now loomed like towering strangers, their branches twisting into clawed hands. The silence became stifling, heavy with a kind of pressure that made my ears ring. And there was this smell, faint but sharp, like copper and wet fur. I shrugged it off as just my nerves getting the best of me. Later, as the campfire crackled and sent flickering shadows dancing across the trees, I heard the first sound that made my blood run cold. A howl, long and mournful, cut through the night. It was distant, but different from any wolf I'd ever heard. This was deeper, more resonant, and wrong. It sent a shiver through my spine. I tried to ignore it and focus on the warmth of the fire, but the sound stayed with me, clawing its way into the pit of my stomach. I was just about to climb into my tent when I saw a beam of light slicing through the darkness. Someone was approaching, the blinding white beam bobbing up and down as it cut a path toward me. A voice called out, "Hello? Everything okay here?" A park ranger, or at least that's what he said. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a green uniform and a wide-brimmed hat, though I couldn't make out much of his face behind the blinding flashlight. He introduced himself as Ranger Travis, and he had this odd, almost rehearsed way of speaking. "What brings you out here?" I asked, trying to sound casual but feeling anything but. "Just doing a routine patrol," he replied, his voice oddly flat, like he was repeating lines he'd memorized. "It's important to keep an eye on folks camping so deep in these woods." There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was how his smile seemed too wide, or how his eyes, just barely visible under the brim of his hat, didn't quite match his friendly tone. Still, I didn't want to seem rude, so I thanked him and assured him everything was fine. "Good," he said, and just stood there for a moment, watching me. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Strange things happen out here. Just be careful." Without another word, he turned and vanished back into the forest, his flashlight bobbing away until it disappeared, leaving me alone with the darkness. I was rattled, but I convinced myself it was just a weird interaction. I went to bed, hoping to sleep off the unease, but that night, I barely slept at all. I woke up to scratching sounds around the tent, like nails dragging across the fabric. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears, listening. Something was circling me, its footsteps heavy, too heavy to be an animal, and they moved unnaturally, fast, then slow, like whatever it was had no sense of rhythm. At one point it sounded like it was right next to my head, just inches away, separated only by the thin nylon of the tent wall. Then it whispered. It whispered my name. A chill ran down my spine as I lay there, too terrified to move. The voice was soft, almost human, but it had this rasp, like dry leaves scraping across stone, and it kept repeating my name over and over in a mocking sing-song tone. "Come out, come out." At some point I must have passed out from fear because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the tent. It was morning, but the unease hadn't gone away. I packed up quickly, eager to put as much distance between me and this place as possible. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour into my hike back, I saw him again, Ranger Travis. He was standing about 50 feet off the trail, just staring at me. I called out, but he didn't respond. He just watched, that too wide smile plastered on his face. Then without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods. That's when I noticed the tracks, footprints in the mud, large, humanoid, but the stride was all wrong. The steps were too far apart, like something was leaping instead of walking. And they weren't headed away from me. They were circling around, crisscrossing the path I'd been walking. And they weren't alone. Intermixed with the footprints were claw marks, deep and gouging into the earth as if something with massive talons had been stalking me alongside those human-like prints. My skin crawled as I realized they led back to my campsite. I sped up, practically running down the trail. But no matter how far I went, the feeling of being watched never left me. Every rustle in the trees, every snapping twig made me jump. And then, just as I started to convince myself I was overreacting, I heard it again. That howl. Closer this time. And then, footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind me. I whipped around, and for a moment I saw it. Not Ranger Travis, but something else. Tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its face stretched into a grotesque parody of a human. It had those same clothes as the ranger, but they hung loosely on its skeletal frame. And its eyes, they were pure black, empty voids that seemed to drink in the light. I ran. I ran harder and faster than I've ever run in my life. The footsteps behind me were relentless, closing the distance, and all the while I could hear it calling my name, that voice rasping and shifting like it was trying to find the right tone. "Come back, don't you want to be safe?" I stumbled out of the woods and practically threw myself into my car. As I tore down the dirt road, I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw it standing at the tree line, its body twisted at impossible angles, still wearing that ranger's uniform. And it was smiling. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, safe in a gas station parking lot, where I finally caught my breath. I told the locals about my experience, and they just shook their heads. "Ranger Travis?" one of them said, his voice trembling with fear. "There hasn't been a ranger by that name out here in decades. Not since he disappeared." That's when it hit me. The thing in the woods, whatever it was, it had been playing a twisted game, wearing a face, mimicking a voice, trying to draw me in. And I could still hear that howl in my head, echoing through the silence, a reminder that out there in those dark ancient woods, something watches, waits, and wears the skin of the lost. And it knows my name. I didn't believe in monsters until last summer. My buddy Jake and I used to go camping all the time. It was our tradition, find a new remote place, haul out our gear, and rough it for a few days away from everything. But this time, we made a mistake. We went too far. We went to a place we should have never gone. Jake had heard of a spot deep in the Kananaskis country, this massive stretch of wilderness in Alberta. The place wasn't marked on any map. He'd heard about it from some guy he met online. Said there was a hidden lake surrounded by dense forest, untouched by civilization. Sounded perfect, so naturally, we decided to check it out. We drove up on a Friday, and the road soon gave way to gravel, then mud, then nothing but overgrown paths that we could barely navigate with Jake's old 4T4. After hours of bumping and skidding through the woods, we finally found a small clearing where we could park and hike the rest of the way. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and earth, and as we trudged deeper into the forest, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects. Just silence. The only sound was our footsteps crunching on leaves and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. It felt unnatural, but I tried to ignore it. This was supposed to be our adventure after all. After what felt like hours, we broke through the trees and found the lake. It was beautiful, like something out of a postcard. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the thick wall of trees that surrounded it on all sides. But what hit me first wasn't the beauty. It was the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. Like eyes were peering at us from every angle. I shrugged it off as paranoia and helped Jake set up camp. But that feeling, it stuck with me. We built a fire, cooked some canned beans, and started knocking back beers, trying to unwind. The sun dipped behind the trees, and soon it was just us, the firelight, and the stars. That's when the noises started. It was faint at first, a rustling in the brush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some raccoon sniffing around. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A shuffling, followed by a soft, wet sound, like something dragging across the ground. Jake heard it too. He sat up straight, flashlight in hand, pointing it out toward the forest. But there was nothing. Just trees and darkness. "Probably just a squirrel or something," Jake muttered, though I could tell he didn't believe it. We both knew no squirrel made noises like that. But what could we do? We weren't about to pack up and leave over a couple of weird noises, so we sat back down and tried to ignore it. An hour passed without incident, and just as I started to relax, we heard a sound that made my blood freeze. And it was a voice, a woman's voice calling out from the trees. "Help me. Please, help me." The voice was weak, desperate, like she was hurt. I shot a look at Jake, who went pale, eyes wide. The voice came again, closer. "Please, I'm lost." Jake got up, grabbing his flashlight and knife. "We have to help her," he said, starting toward the woods. I grabbed his arm, yanking him back. Wait, think about it. We haven't seen a single soul all day. There's no way someone's out here in the middle of nowhere just randomly calling for help. The voice called again, louder this time. Please, I'm hurt. And then it hit me. There was something wrong with that voice. It was too flat, too perfect. It sounded like a recording, like someone was playing a tape on a loop. Help me. Please, help me. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting from the trees to me. What if it's real? He whispered. But the voice was getting closer, and something deep in my gut told me that whatever was making that sound wasn't human, or at least wasn't right. Then, without warning, the voice changed. It dropped low, like a growl hidden under layers of sound. Help me. The last word stretched out, distorting, warping into a guttural, inhuman snarl that made my skin crawl. And then through the darkness we saw movement. Something stepped out of the tree line, and for a second I thought it was a person. But as it moved closer to the firelight, I realized it was all wrong. It stood on two legs, tall and thin, its body covered in matted fur or hair, its limbs long and bent at odd angles, almost like it was made of twisted branches. And its face was blank, like a smooth mask of skin with no eyes, no mouth. But it was looking at us. I could feel it. Jake and I froze. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us breathed. And then, slowly, it lifted one long, clawed hand and pointed at us. That's when we bolted. We ran as fast as we could, crashing through the trees in the dark, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, moving fast, but it wasn't running. It sounded like it was gliding, like its feet never touched the ground. And all the while that voice continued, echoing through the forest in that mocking, inhuman tone. Help me! Help me! We finally reached the truck, jumping in and locking the doors. Jake fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad he nearly dropped them. I kept my eyes glued to the tree line, praying we'd outrun it. When the engine roared to life, I felt a flicker of hope. But as we sped away, I made the mistake of looking in the side mirror. It was there. That thing running beside us, its limbs contorting and twisting, bending in ways no living creature should be able to. It moved impossibly fast, keeping up with the truck, and then it stopped. Dead in its tracks. And as we tore down the dirt road, I saw it lift one hand, almost like it was waving goodbye. We didn't stop driving until we hit the nearest town, hours later. We tried to tell the locals what happened, but they just looked at us like we were crazy. No one goes up that way, one old man told us, shaking his head. Not anymore, you boys are lucky you got out of there. Jake doesn't talk about it anymore. I can tell it haunts him, though. I see it in his eyes when we pass the woods on the highway, that flicker of fear. We haven't gone camping since, and me. Well, I moved to the city, but sometimes late at night I'll hear it. That voice, faint but clear, whispering through the open window. Help me, help me. And I know somewhere out there in the dark it's waiting, watching, for someone foolish enough to listen. I've always been a sucker for adventure, the kind that takes you far away from civilization and drops you right into the heart of nature. That's why I volunteered to join a wildlife research team that spent weeks deep in the Ozark Mountains, far from any towns or trails. Our job was to monitor the population of black bears, set up trail cams, and document other wildlife behaviors in the area. Simple enough, right? But what I encountered there was something no one could ever prepare for. Our team consisted of 4 people, me, Jake, a seasoned wildlife biologist, Sarah, a tracker, and Mike, a tech guy who handled all the camera equipment. We hiked about 20 miles into the thickest part of the forest, a place where the trees grew so closely together you could barely see 10 feet ahead of you, the kind of isolation that gets under your skin after a while. But for the first few days, everything went smoothly. By day we'd explore the forest, set up cameras, and note signs of bear activity. The nights, though, those were different. The first strange thing happened on the 3rd night. Sarah and I were sitting by the fire when we heard something. It wasn't the usual sound of animals scurrying in the underbrush. No, this was deliberate. Heavy footsteps, slow and methodical, just beyond the glow of the fire. We both froze, our ears straining to make sense of what we were hearing. "Bear?" I whispered, but Sarah shook her head. She'd been tracking animals for years and knew how to tell them apart by sound. "No, too slow. Too human." Jake and Mike were inside their tents already, but we didn't want to wake them over what was probably nothing. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and stood up, her breath visible in the cool night air. She scanned the trees, the light flickering over the thick trunks and branches. Nothing. Just as she turned back to sit down, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow, moving between the trees. It was fast, too fast for a human. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. "Probably just an animal," she said, but there was a tremor in her voice that told me she didn't believe it either. The next morning, Jake found something odd by one of the cameras, a deer carcass, half-eaten, but what was strange was the way it was, arranged. The deer's head was twisted almost completely around, and its limbs were splayed out in unnatural positions, almost like someone had posed it. The camera above the kill had been ripped from the tree and crushed. "Bear?" I asked Jake, though deep down I knew the answer. "No bear did this," he muttered, staring at the carcass. "This is something else." That night the sounds started again, but this time they were closer. Footsteps, louder now, circling our camp like whatever was out there was testing us, waiting. The fire crackled, but it didn't feel like it provided any comfort. The woods felt darker, heavier. Mike, usually the jokester of the group, was visibly on edge. "Maybe we should pack up tomorrow," he suggested, trying to sound casual but failing. "You know, relocate. This area feels wrong." Jake scoffed. "We've only been out here a few days. Don't get spooked just because of a few strange noises." But that night something happened that none of us could explain. I woke up to the sound of scraping. Not far away, something was dragging itself against the trees, slow and deliberate. The air in my tent felt thick with dread. I couldn't move, too terrified to even breathe. And then it spoke. A voice, raspy, guttural, echoed through the campsite. "Come, closer." It was faint at first, almost like the wind had carried it. But then it came again, louder, closer. "Come, closer." I shot upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice, it wasn't anyone in our group, yet it sounded vaguely familiar. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, I saw that everyone else was already out there too, flashlights in hand, pale faces turned toward the woods. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake nodded, his usual bravado gone. "We're leaving, first thing in the morning." The voice echoed again, this time from a different direction. "Come, closer." I shone my flashlight toward the trees, and for a brief second, I saw it. A figure, tall, emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, almost like it was struggling to control its limbs. Its eyes, hollow and black, locked onto mine, and it smiled. A wide, grotesque smile that stretched too far across its face. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling from my hand. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. We were all too stunned, too terrified to move. The figure tilted its head like it was curious, before slipping back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't sleep that night. Every hour the voice would return, always saying the same thing. "Come, closer." But now it wasn't just a voice. The creature would dart between the trees, always just out of reach, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. By dawn, we were packed and ready to leave, but when we checked the cameras before heading out, we found something that chilled us to the bone. The footage had captured the creature, barely visible in the dark, but there. It was watching us, standing just outside our camp, its head cocked at that unnatural angle. But that wasn't the worst part. In one of the frames, the creature's face had changed. It wasn't smiling anymore. It was wearing Jake's face. I don't know how to describe it, but the creature had somehow mimicked Jake's features perfectly. His eyes, his mouth, even the scar on his chin. Except it wasn't him. The face was twisted, distorted, like it had been stretched too far over the creature's gaunt frame. We left without saying much. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump, convinced that the creature was following us, waiting for the right moment to strike. When we finally made it back to civilization, we tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. How could they? The footage was dismissed as a glitch, the creature a trick of the light. But we knew better. Jake quit the team a week later, said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. Sarah moved to the city, as far away from the woods as she could get. Mike stopped talking to all of us entirely. As for me, I can still hear it sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet. That voice whispering from the darkness, "Come closer." I've been a park ranger in the remote woods of the Pacific Northwest for nearly 10 years. This place has always felt like home. Endless miles of towering trees, dense fog that rolls in at dawn, and the quiet isolation that comes with being stationed miles from the nearest town. But last week something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. It started like any other night. The fire in my cabin was crackling, casting a warm glow against the wooden walls, and the wind howled outside, typical for this time of year. My job was simple that night. Monitor the radio, check the trails the next morning, and ensure no campers were lost or in danger. Routine. Boring even. Just as I was about to turn in, the radio crackled to life. "Help. Please. Anyone. Something's out here." The voice was barely audible, distorted by static. It sounded like a man, but there was something off. An edge of panic that chilled me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, thinking maybe a camper had wandered too far or gotten spooked by a bear. The voice didn't give me a location, but I knew the area like the back of my hand. I followed the main trail deeper into the woods, the cold biting at my skin as the canopy above blotted out the stars. After about an hour of walking, I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, even the distant rustling of small animals, had vanished. The silence was unnatural, heavy. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't shake the voice from the radio. I pushed on. That's when I saw the footprints. At first glance they looked human, but they were wrong, too long, too narrow, and they were fresh, leading off the trail into the dense brush. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The further I went, the more disoriented I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. Just at the edge of the light, a figure darting between the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the dark. Then the noises began. At first it was a soft rustling, like something moving through the leaves behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I kept walking, quickening my pace, but the rustling followed. No matter how fast I moved, it stayed just out of sight. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief strobe of light, I caught a glimpse of it. A hunched figure, its limbs unnaturally long, crouching low to the ground. Panic surged through me. I started running, crashing through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest felt like a maze, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The trees, once familiar, now loomed like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. As I ran, the sounds grew louder, not just the rustling now, but whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo in my head. My legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into a clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the open space. And that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, tall, gaunt, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. It was human, but not quite. The smell of decay wafted toward me, and I gagged, backing away. The thing took a step forward and then another, moving with an unnatural, jerky motion, like it wasn't used to its own body. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. I raised my flashlight and the creature flinched, hissing, before retreating into the tree line. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted back toward the cabin, not caring if I was heading in the right direction. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, but I kept running. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My chest heaved, and sweat drenched my clothes, but I was safe, or so I thought. The radio crackled to life again, and this time the voice was clear. It was my own. "I'm out here, lost. Please help me." I stared at the radio, my blood turning to ice. That wasn't possible. I was here, inside, listening. But then I realized the truth, the horrible, gut-wrenching truth that made my skin crawl. The voice wasn't asking for help. It was mimicking me, trying to lure me back outside. My hand trembled as I turned off the radio, but before I could fully process what had just happened, a knock came at the door. Slow, deliberate, too loud to be human. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it, a voice from the other side, distorted, familiar. "Let me in, I'm lost. It's cold out here." It was my voice. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it. And then the knocking stopped, replaced by something far worse, a scraping sound like nails dragging across the wood. The windows rattled, and for the briefest moment I saw it again. Pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes staring in, the creature grinned, that impossible grin. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, because when I woke up, the sun was rising, and the forest was quiet again. Normal. But as I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. On the ground, leading away from my cabin, were footprints, long, narrow footprints, the same ones I'd seen in the woods. And worse, right outside my door, written in the dirt, was a single word: soon. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I turned in my resignation the next day. But sometimes late at night I hear it, the faint rustling, the whispers, and I wonder, did I ever really leave those woods, or did something follow me home? I was a seasoned camper, well versed in surviving the wild, especially in the vast, dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains. For me, the solitude was a welcome retreat, a place where I could disconnect from the chaos of modern life and immerse myself in nature's raw beauty. But the trip I took last fall was different. It was my last, and I've never returned to the woods since. You'll understand why soon enough. I had chosen a remote spot, miles from any trailhead or known campsite, a place I was certain no other human had set foot in for years. The trees here were ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, and the canopy was so dense that the sunlight barely pierced through, leaving the forest floor in perpetual twilight. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first 2 days were uneventful. I set up camp by a small creek, spent my days hiking, fishing, and reading by the fire at night. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant owl. It was peaceful, serene. But on the third night, everything changed. It started with the noises, subtle at first, barely noticeable over the crackling of my campfire. Soft footsteps, like something, or someone, was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably a deer or some other curious animal. But as the night wore on, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, like they were circling me, closing in. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark, impenetrable woods. Still, the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. It was unnerving, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. After all, I was miles away from civilization. No one knew I was out here. No one could be out here. The next morning, I found footprints around my camp, human footprints. But they weren't like any I had ever seen. They were large, almost grotesque, and the toes were elongated, ending in claw-like impressions in the dirt. A chill crept up my spine, but I rationalized it. Maybe some hunter had passed through, maybe even playing a prank. Yeah, that had to be it. I packed up my gear, deciding to hike deeper into the forest, farther from whatever had left those prints. The further I walked, the stranger things became. The trees here were even older, their bark covered in strange markings, symbols maybe, or runes etched deep into the wood. I didn't recognize them, but they felt old, ancient. The air grew heavier, colder, and the forest itself seemed wrong. By nightfall, I set up camp again, uneasy but exhausted. That's when I heard it, the howling. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or a coyote. It was something else, something primal and guttural, echoing through the trees. It sounded like a cross between a scream and a growl, and it was close, too close. My fire flickered, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing. Then I saw it, just beyond the firelight at the edge of the clearing, a figure, tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long. It stood on two legs, but it was hunched, almost crawling, its head cocked at an unnatural angle as if studying me. My heart pounded in my chest and I froze, too terrified to move. The creature slowly crept closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the firelight, yellow, predatory. I grabbed my knife, knowing full well it would do nothing against whatever this thing was. I could hear its raspy breathing now, shallow and labored like it was savoring the moment, toying with me. And then it stopped. It stood perfectly still just a few feet away and sniffed the air. It let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a laugh. That's when I realized something truly terrifying. It was wearing clothes, tattered old clothing like a human's. But the fabric hung loosely on its gaunt, inhuman frame, as though it had been torn and stretched to fit over something far too large and monstrous. Without warning, the creature lunged forward. I scrambled backward, barely managing to dodge as it swiped at me with its long, clawed hand. I grabbed my pack and bolted into the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the trees, moving faster than anything that size should be able to. I ran for what felt like hours, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning, legs screaming in pain. But no matter how far I went, the sounds followed. The breaking of branches, the heavy breathing, the guttural laughter. It was playing with me. At some point I stumbled into a cave, a shallow one, barely more than a depression in the side of a hill, but it was the only shelter I could find. I huddled inside, heart pounding in my ears, trying to control my breathing. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, but I knew it was out there, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed in that cave, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. When I woke, the forest was quiet and the sun was rising. I cautiously emerged from the cave, every muscle tense, expecting the creature to be waiting for me. But the clearing was empty. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed what I could and started making my way back toward the trailhead, never once stopping to rest. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in the daylight. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. But I didn't see the creature again, not in the way I had the night before, at least. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly collapsed. I threw my gear inside, started the engine, and tore out of there, not once looking back. It wasn't until I got home and began unpacking my things that I noticed something was missing, my knife, the one I had slept with in my hand. In its place inside my pack was something else, something I hadn't put there. A small hand-carved wooden figure, a figure with long limbs, hollow eyes, and a twisted, crooked grin. a figure that looked exactly like the thing I had seen in the woods. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I do know one thing. Those woods weren't just empty stretches of wilderness. There's something there, something ancient, something malevolent, something that knows I saw it. And I have a feeling it won't forget me anytime soon. I've always loved camping alone. There's something about the isolation, the quiet, that makes me feel at peace. The world slows down out there, away from the constant hum of civilization, the noise of traffic, and the suffocating crowds. Just you, the trees, and the stars. It was my way of resetting, escaping the grind. But after my last trip, I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. I'd found this spot on a hiking trip a few months back. It was perfect, far off the beaten path, nestled deep in the woods by a small, crystal-clear lake. No one else ever came out this far, at least, not that I had seen. And that was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I packed light, just the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, some food, a camp stove, and my trusty flashlight. The hike in was a good 2 hours, winding through dense forest, the trail disappearing in places where nature had reclaimed it. I finally arrived at the clearing by the lake just before dusk. The air was cool, crisp. Perfect weather. I set up camp quickly, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees. After getting my tent set up and starting a small fire, I sat by the edge of the water, watching the last of the sunlight fade. The forest around me was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. Out here, quiet was normal. It's what I came for. As night fell, I cooked a small meal over the fire and stretched out by the flames, staring up at the stars. There was no moon that night, so the sky was a blanket of tiny, sparkling dots. It was peaceful, calming, and before long I started to drift off. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound somewhere behind me in the trees. At first I didn't think much of it. Probably just a deer or some small animal moving through the underbrush. But then the sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate rustling, as if something or someone was moving carefully, trying not to be heard. I sat up, my heart starting to race, and grabbed my flashlight. I shined it toward the trees where the sound had come from, sweeping the beam back and forth, but saw nothing. The forest was still. My fire crackled quietly, the only sound breaking the silence. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a raccoon, maybe a fox. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. I tossed a couple of extra logs on the fire, hoping the light would keep any curious animals at bay, and sat back down, trying to calm my nerves. Minutes passed, and the rustling sound didn't return. The firelight flickered against the trees, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, just the woods playing tricks on my mind. I settled back in, pulling my jacket tighter around me as the night air grew colder. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but I was sure I'd seen something. I snapped my flashlight toward the spot, heart hammering in my chest, but again there was nothing. Just the trees, swaying slightly in the night breeze. I stood up, scanning the forest with my light, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was an animal, a trick of the light, anything. But as I stood there, straining to listen, I felt it. That gut feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. That's when the sound started. A slow, deliberate tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against a tree trunk. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the trees to my left, just out of the range of the firelight. I whipped the flashlight in that direction, my pulse racing, but again saw nothing. The tapping continued, rhythmic, methodical. Closer now. I stepped toward the sound, keeping the light trained on the trees. The tapping stopped. Silence. I stood there, frozen, barely breathing. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a voice. A low, whispering voice, just loud enough to hear, but too faint to make out the words. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded distant, but the woods can play tricks on you like that. Sound carries weirdly in the trees. I slowly backed away toward the fire. My flashlight flickered, then went out. Panic shot through me as I frantically slapped it, trying to get it to work again. The fire cast long, flickering shadows across the ground, but without the flashlight, the darkness around me felt suffocating. The whispering continued, closer now. I backed up until I was practically on top of the fire, my hands trembling. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I kept turning in circles, scanning the edge of the clearing, but there was nothing. Just the shadows and that voice whispering something I couldn't understand. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was dead silent. No wind, no whispers, just the crackling of the fire and my own ragged breathing. I stood there, straining to hear anything at all. Then from directly behind me, just inches from my ear, I heard a voice. "Leave." I spun around, heart in my throat, but no one was there. Nothing, just the dark forest stretching out before me. That was it. I wasn't sticking around to see what came next. I grabbed my pack, dumped water on the fire, and tore down my tent in record time. I didn't care about packing neatly or making sense of what had just happened. I just needed to get the hell out of there. I hiked back in the dark, stumbling over roots and rocks, the only light coming from the dim glow of my phone. Every few minutes I swore I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, always just far enough back that I couldn't see what was making them. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't stop to think. I threw my gear in the trunk, jumped in, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I haven't been back to that lake since, and I don't plan to. Something was out there that night, something that wasn't human. I don't know what it wanted, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. And now every time I think about going camping alone again, I remember that voice just inches from my ear, whispering one word: leave. I never thought I'd end up telling this story to anyone, much less strangers on the internet. But hell, maybe it'll help me sleep at night if I can finally get it out. Or maybe it'll just remind me how real everything was. Either way, I'm tired of keeping this to myself. So here it is. I used to be a park ranger, the kind of guy you'd see strolling through state parks with a smile on my face, happy to answer questions about hiking trails and safe camping practices. I loved my job. It was everything I'd wanted since I was a kid. I grew up in the woods, so it always felt like home to me, a place where I could be free, peaceful, safe. That all changed last fall. I was stationed at the Black Hollow State Park, a huge stretch of wilderness, deep forests, and isolated lakes that didn't see much foot traffic outside of hunting season. On one particular night, I was tasked with patrolling the northern edge of the park. A lone camping permit had come through earlier in the week, and it was my job to check in on campers, make sure no one was getting into trouble. The weather was unseasonably cold that night, a biting chill that cut straight through my ranger uniform, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I took my ATV out along the dirt paths, winding between pines and oaks, their limbs stretching like skeletal fingers overhead. The moon was full but shrouded in mist, casting pale light through a haze of fog. It felt like the world was holding its breath, silent, waiting for something. I should have taken it as a sign. After about an hour of driving, I found the campsite, a lone tent pitched next to a dying fire, with an old pickup truck parked nearby, a perfect spot for some peace and quiet, away from everything. I turned off my engine and the sound echoed through the emptiness before falling into dead silence. I called out, a quick "Park Ranger, just checking in," and waited for a response. Nothing. I got off the ATV, shining my flashlight around the site. The tent flaps were open, and when I peeked inside, it was empty. But their gear was still there, sleeping bags, cooler, a couple of books. It looked like whoever was camping just wandered off. Maybe they went for a walk, I thought, but in this cold, in the dark? It didn't add up. I decided to do a quick search around the site, shining my flashlight into the trees. The forest loomed like a wall around the clearing, thick and oppressive. Every now and then, my light would catch something in the darkness, a squirrel skittering away, the glint of a spider's eyes, but no sign of the camper. That's when I heard it. A low guttural growl, deep and long, like it came from something massive. It rumbled through the air and into my chest, making my whole body tense up. My hand instinctively went to my hip, where my sidearm was holstered. I tried to tell myself it was a bear, a big one maybe, but I'd been around bears before. This wasn't that. It was wrong. I spun around, aiming my flashlight toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. 2 eyes. Yellow, glowing in the dark, just beyond the tree line. They were set too high for any normal animal, staring down at me from at least 7, maybe 8 feet up. And the thing didn't blink. It just watched me. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked, echoing back to me in the eerie silence. The eyes narrowed and I heard something like a soft laugh, a horrible wet rasp, almost human but not quite. I felt a creeping fear crawl up my spine, and I swear, it felt like the trees themselves were closing in around me. Then the eyes moved. Quick, too quick. 1 second they were staring right at me, and then they darted to the right, disappearing behind the trees. I fumbled with my flashlight, trying to track the movement, but it was gone. That's when the screams started, blood-curdling, agonized screams that seemed to come from every direction at once, bouncing through the forest like a sickening echo. I ran to my ATV, fumbling with the keys as the screams grew louder, closer. They didn't sound human. They were too high-pitched, like the wail of a rabbit mixed with a woman's cry. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the engine to start. The second the engine roared to life, the screaming stopped. Dead silence again, like someone had flipped a switch. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, that gut-wrenching sensation of being watched. And then I saw it. In my side mirror, just behind me in the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs too long, its body thin and hunched, like it was made of sticks bound together. It looked like a person, but all wrong, and those eyes, those yellow eyes locked onto me, glowing with an otherworldly light. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. I hit the gas and tore out of there, the ATV skidding and bouncing over roots and rocks as I sped back down the trail. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept going, the engine screaming in the night, the wind biting at my face. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, breathless and covered in a cold sweat. When I tried to explain what I saw, my supervisor just gave me a look, one of those "you're tired and seeing things" looks, and told me to take the rest of the night off. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I sat in the corner of my cabin, lights on, shotgun in my lap, staring out the window. But nothing came. The next day I went back to the campsite with a few other rangers. The tent was still there, undisturbed, the fire pit cold. But there were no signs of the camper. And here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. We found tracks, but not human tracks. Deep prints in the mud like clawed hands, each finger long and tapered, with strange marks crisscrossing like scales or fur. They led away from the tent, vanishing into the forest like the creature had taken flight. The camper was never found. No body, no gear, just gone. I quit a week later. Couldn't shake that feeling of those yellow eyes on me burning into my soul. I moved to the city, as far from the woods as I could get, but at night sometimes. I hear that laughter, that wet, rasping sound, and I see those eyes. I've told myself it was all just my imagination, a trick of the fog, or the cold, or maybe just a bear. But deep down I know the truth. And somewhere out there in the black hollow something is watching, waiting. And if you're ever out there, pray it never finds you. I've never been the kind of guy to scare easily. You don't become a park ranger in the wilderness of northern Montana if you're afraid of being alone in the woods. But what happened during my last overnight patrol, it's changed me. There are things in these woods that don't belong in this world, things we're not supposed to understand. It was late fall, just before the snow was set to blanket the mountains. The pines were thick, the air crisp and cold, and the daylight barely lasted a few hours. I was sent out to check on a remote part of the park where hikers had reported strange noises, howling, strange echoes, and what they described as whispers in the wind. Whispers. I scoffed when I first heard it. Probably some over-imaginative campers, spooked by the isolation. But orders were orders, so I packed my gear, loaded my rifle, and set out for a 2-night solo patrol to investigate. I wasn't too concerned. I'd dealt with bears, wolves, and even mountain lions before. This wouldn't be any different, or so I thought. The first night was quiet enough. The wind picked up around midnight, making the trees sway and creak, but nothing unusual. I set up camp at the base of a ridge, a good vantage point to observe the surrounding forest. The stars were out, and despite the cold, there was a sense of peace. The only sound was the crackling of my campfire and the occasional rustle of pine needles in the breeze. That peace didn't last long. Around 2 a.m. I woke up. I didn't know why at first, just a sudden jolt from deep sleep into full alertness. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. The wind had died completely. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and then I heard it. A whisper. Not like the wind through the trees. No, this was a voice, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It sounded like it was coming from just outside my tent. I froze, straining to listen, every hair on my body standing on end. Come out. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something off about it. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the handle of my knife under the blanket, heart racing. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed and the whispering stopped. I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe some far-off animal call. I wasn't going to let a little sound scare me out of a good night's sleep. The next day, I hiked deeper into the forest, keeping an eye out for tracks or signs of anything unusual. Nothing. The woods were dead quiet, more so than they should have been. I should have heard birds, squirrels, something, but it was like the entire forest had gone mute. Still no signs of any disturbances. By the time the sun began to set, I was tired and frustrated. Another night. Then I'd report back. Probably chalk it all up to paranoia. I set up camp in a different location that night, closer to a river. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was comforting. I built a small fire and settled in, determined to get some sleep. But just as I was drifting off, it happened again. The whisper. This time it was clearer, closer. Come out. We're waiting. My blood turned to ice. It was as though the voice was right outside my tent, no more than a few feet away. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the inside of the tent. I listened. No footsteps, no movement. Just the whispering. I grabbed my rifle, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow around the clearing. The trees loomed tall and still, their branches like skeletal fingers against the starless sky. I swept my flashlight through the trees, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the forest. Over here, the voice whispered again, from the direction of the river. I whipped around, shining the light toward the sound, but all I saw were the trees and the glint of moonlight on the water. I wanted to call out, demand whoever it was to show themselves, but something stopped me. Some deep, primal instinct told me that if I spoke, if I acknowledged the voice, something terrible would happen. That's when I saw them, 2 figures standing just at the edge of the clearing. At first I thought they were people, tall, humanoid shapes, barely visible in the darkness. But as I focused the light on them, my stomach twisted in horror. They weren't people. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their skin, if you could call it that, was pale and stretched tight over bones that seemed to jut out at odd angles. Their faces... God, their faces were wrong. No eyes, just dark hollows where eyes should be. And their mouths, twisted into wide, unnatural grins that stretched far too wide. One of them raised a hand, its fingers unnaturally long, and pointed at me. "Come join us," it whispered, though its mouth never moved. I backed away, rifle trembling in my hands. The figures didn't move. They just stood there watching. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at those things, but eventually I forced myself to move. I grabbed my pack, doused the remnants of the fire, and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station. It was dawn by the time I made it back, breathless, cold, and drenched in sweat. I told my supervisor what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but he just gave me that look. You know the one. The look that says, "You've been in the woods too long." I don't go out there alone anymore. Hell, I don't even stay after dark if I can help it. Those things, whatever they were, they're still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when the wind dies down, I swear I can still hear them whispering. "Come join us." I don't know what they are, but one thing's for sure. They know my name. I used to hike and camp all the time, my way to unwind after a long week stuck behind a desk. Alone in the wilderness, away from the noise of the world, it felt like freedom. At least, it used to. But after what happened last fall, I'll never set foot in a forest again. It was October, the perfect season to be outside. That brisk, clean air, the trees all flaming red and gold. It's like the woods themselves are alive. So, I took a long weekend off and decided to go somewhere new, a place called Blackthorn Forest, way up north off the beaten trail. I had heard about it from an old hiking forum where some guy mentioned it was untouched, perfect for real campers. The drive up was long and winding. There weren't even proper signs leading to Blackthorn, just an old road that seemed to go on forever, narrowing and twisting through dense trees. And finally, I reached a rusty metal gate with a hand-painted sign that read, "Blackthorn Forest, enter at your own risk." I assumed it was just a leftover joke from whoever managed the place. I mean, what could possibly happen? I parked the car, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and set off down the main trail. But after about half a mile, I found something strange. A tattered map nailed to a tree. The ink was smudged and faded, but it showed a trail leading deeper into the woods that wasn't on any official map. Perfect, I thought. A hidden path. I figured this must be what the forum was talking about, so I decided to follow it. I didn't see a single soul for hours. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustling leaves as deer bolted off into the underbrush. After hiking all day, I set up camp by a small stream and lit a fire as the sun dipped below the trees. Darkness fell quickly, and with it came that eerie quiet you only get deep in the woods. But I didn't mind. I loved it. I had just settled into my tent, the warmth of the fire still flickering outside, when I heard footsteps, soft but unmistakable, like someone was walking along the trail. I peeked out, expecting to see another hiker, but instead I saw a man standing by the edge of the trees, just outside the ring of firelight. He wore an old, worn-out park ranger's uniform, and his face was deeply lined, like he'd been out there for decades. He had this odd, unsettling smile on his face, and it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. Hey," I replied, a bit startled. I hadn't seen any rangers marked on the trail map, and I couldn't remember passing a ranger station. "You camping alone?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine, that smile never wavering. "Yeah, just for the weekend. I didn't think there'd be any rangers out this far." "Oh, we're out here," he said, voice low and gravelly. "Out here to keep folks safe, you know." "Safe from what?" I asked, trying to laugh it off. The ranger's smile faded, just a flicker of something in his eyes, worry maybe, or fear. "Just things that come out at night. Best to stay on the main trail, stick to the light." He gestured to my fire, his eyes drifting to the dark woods behind me. "Okay, thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, tipped his hat again, and then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed up for hours, the fire burning bright, every snap of a branch or whisper of wind sending my nerves on edge. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, dreaming uneasy dreams of shadowy figures stalking the woods around me. I woke up to silence, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that makes your ears ring. And as I opened my eyes, I noticed two things. My fire was completely out, just cold ashes now, and my tent flap was open. That's when I saw them, footprints. They circled my campsite, leading from the trail into the woods and then back out again, like someone, or something, had been watching me while I slept. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the ranger had come back, maybe it was an animal. But the prints were too big and they had a weird shape, almost like a person's foot, but wrong. Like the toes were too long, and there were claw marks at the ends. I packed up quickly, heart pounding, and decided to head back to my car. The sooner I got out of there, the better. I tried to follow the trail I'd come in on, but no matter how far I walked, it didn't look familiar. I checked my map, but that only made things worse. None of the landmarks lined up. It was like the forest itself had changed overnight. I must have walked in circles for hours until the sun started to set again. I was panicking, trying to find any clue to get me back to the road. And then I saw him, the ranger, standing ahead on the trail, still wearing that worn uniform, still with that unsettling smile. "Thank God," I said, rushing up to him. "I've been lost all day. I need to get back to my car." The ranger didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, that same smile frozen on his face. "You've wandered too deep," he finally said, his voice softer now, like he was telling me a secret. "They don't let you leave once you've seen them." "What? Who doesn't let you leave?" I asked, feeling a growing dread. "The Watchers," he whispered, leaning in close. "They watch, they wait, they feed." Before I could ask him what he meant, he stepped off the trail and vanished into the trees like a ghost. I ran after him, but when I got to where he'd stood, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just endless woods. I turned back to the trail, but it was gone too, swallowed up by the forest. And then I heard it, a low growling hum like something huge was breathing just inches from my ear. The trees around me started to sway, and I swear I saw shapes moving between them. Tall, thin figures, their eyes glowing like embers in the growing darkness. They watched me, just as the ranger had warned. I ran. I ran like hell, tearing through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face, the trees seeming to close in on me. The growling grew louder, and I could hear laughter, soft, mocking laughter from all around. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, to escape whatever was hunting me. Somehow, by some miracle, I stumbled onto a dirt path that led to the road. I found my car, threw my pack into the back, and drove without stopping, not even to catch my breath, until I was miles away from Blackthorn Forest. I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. But a few nights later, I woke up to a tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, my heart in my throat, and slowly turned to look. There, on the other side of the glass, was a face, lined and leathery, with a familiar, unsettling smile. The ranger. His eyes locked onto mine, and his lips moved silently. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I knew what it was. "You've wandered too deep. They don't let you leave." I shut my blinds, curled into a ball, and waited for the tapping to stop. Eventually it did, but every night since I've heard it. Light, rhythmic tapping, sometimes at my window, sometimes on the door. Always just after midnight, and every time I know he's out there watching me, waiting for the day I slip back into the woods. Because once you've been to Blackthorn Forest, it never lets you go, and neither do they. So if you ever find yourself up north looking for a hike, take my advice. Stay far, far away from Blackthorn Forest. And if a ranger ever warns you to stay on the main trail, listen to him. You don't want to meet the things that come out at night. People always say the woods are peaceful, full of life and beauty, I used to believe that, but sometimes I think the woods are a trap, a living thing just waiting for the right person to wander in and never leave. And last month I almost became one of those people. A few weeks ago, my buddy Sam and I decided to go backpacking in the remote parts of Shenandoah National Park. We were both experienced hikers, but that trip, well, it nearly broke me. If I close my eyes, I can still hear the sounds from that night, the whispers that still haunt me, the endless shadows dancing between the trees. Sam was all about finding the path less traveled, so instead of sticking to the mapped trails, we made our way deep into the underbrush, where the forest was thicker and wilder, where the silence weighed heavy and the shadows loomed just a bit longer. We hiked for 2 days straight, barely talking except to point out landmarks and make sure we were heading in the right direction. It was like we were under some kind of spell, both of us just pushing forward, deeper and deeper into the woods. On the third night, we stumbled upon this old ranger's cabin, abandoned and nearly swallowed by the forest. The walls were weathered gray wood, some planks rotted and crumbling. One of the windows was shattered and the roof had mostly collapsed in, but it seemed like a good place to set up camp. I mean, why not, right? It's not every day you get to sleep in some creepy, forgotten ranger station. We built a fire just outside and settled in for the night. As the fire crackled, we sat there sharing a flask, telling dumb jokes, trying to spook each other with ghost stories. But just as I was starting to relax, the woods around us fell silent. Like dead silent. It was so quiet that the only sound was the snapping of wood from the fire, and I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. I laughed it off, nervously blaming it on the creepy old cabin, but Sam wasn't having it. "Shh," he whispered, putting a finger to his lips and leaning forward. "Did you hear that?" I strained my ears but didn't hear anything, just the hiss of the fire and nothing else. "Dude, you're freaking me out," I said, half joking. But Sam's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the tree line. "It's like someone's talking," he muttered, barely moving his lips. "Can't you hear it?" I didn't hear voices, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. I scanned the darkness, feeling like we were being watched. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, my voice faltering, but we both knew it wasn't. Then it happened. A whistle, long and high-pitched like a bird call, but wrong somehow, echoing all around us. Sam shot to his feet, his eyes wide and wild, and I followed, feeling my pulse pounding in my throat. "Who's there?" Sam yelled out, his voice cracking. We waited, but there was no response, just the whistle, repeating over and over, moving through the trees like it was circling us. I suggested we go inside the cabin, thinking that maybe having walls around us would make it feel safer. But the moment we stepped inside, it felt like the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The cabin smelled of mildew and wet wood, and the darkness felt heavy, pressing against us like a living thing. We decided to just hole up there for the night, build a bigger fire in the cabin's stone hearth, and wait until daylight to hike back to civilization. That's when I saw the markings. Scratched into the walls, covering every inch of wood, were symbols, twisted, jagged shapes like stick figures or runes. Some were gouged so deeply that bits of wood splintered and hung loose. They looked angry, desperate, like someone had scratched them in with shaking hands. "Jesus, what the hell is this?" I whispered, running my hand over the carvings. I tried to make sense of them, but I couldn't. Sam didn't answer. He was just staring at the door, breathing heavily. The whistle came again, closer this time. It was so loud, I swear it was right outside the cabin. And this time, it wasn't alone. There were other sounds, footsteps, snapping twigs, and something else. A voice, faint, whispering our names. "Mike!" I looked at Sam, and his eyes were wide with terror. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here right now." But as soon as he stepped toward the door, we heard it slam shut, hard, and then the rattling of chains. It sounded like someone locking it from the outside. Sam rushed to the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. I ran to one of the broken windows, desperate to climb out, but the moment I stuck my head out, something cold and sharp grazed my cheek, and I pulled back, blood dripping down my face. That's when I saw them, or it. A figure stood just beyond the window, tall and hunched, its face obscured by a hood of what looked like tattered fur or matted hair. It's hard to describe what I saw. The thing's body seemed to shift and bend unnaturally, like it was made of branches and sinew. It whispered our names in both our voices, overlapping and twisted. Meek, Sam. It sounded like it was trying on our voices, figuring out how to mimic them perfectly. We were trapped in this rotting cabin with that thing circling around us, calling our names, scratching its nails or claws or whatever it had along the walls. And then it started to laugh. A wet, gurgling sound, like something was stuck in its throat. Sam and I backed away from the door, keeping our eyes on the window, trying to find a way out. And that's when I felt it. The floor beneath me seemed to sink slightly, like I was standing on a trapdoor. Desperate, I kicked at the floorboards and they cracked, revealing a small crawl space underneath. Without thinking, I grabbed Sam and we dropped down into the darkness, dragging the boards back over our heads as quietly as we could. We lay there holding our breath, squeezed together in that tiny space, listening to the creature pacing above us, and then it started speaking again. But it wasn't our names this time. It was arguing with itself. A dozen voices, all overlapping. 1 minute it was a child, giggling and whispering. The next, it was my own voice, pleading, screaming for help. The voices didn't stop until dawn. I think I must have passed out at some point, because the next thing I remember was waking up to silence. Real silence. We waited until we were sure it was gone before we crawled out and ran. We left everything behind, our gear, the fire, everything, and ran until we found the nearest trailhead. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but ever since that night I've been hearing the whistle. Soft, faint, but always there. When I'm in bed at night, when I'm walking down the street. And sometimes, when I answer the phone, I hear my own voice on the other end, whispering my name. I think whatever was in those woods is still out there, and it's looking for me, and it's getting closer. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you hear a whistle or you think you hear your name being called, don't go looking. Don't run. Don't even breathe. Just close your eyes and pray. I've been a park ranger for almost 15 years now, stationed deep in the Blackwood National Forest. It's one of those places where the trees grow so thick, it feels like the forest swallows all sound. The air is perpetually cool, even in summer, and the wind whispers things you'd rather not hear. It's the kind of place that unnerves you, even on a good day. But I loved it, until the night everything changed. It started like any other evening. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. I was heading out for my usual patrol, a last sweep before nightfall. I packed my gear, double-checked my flashlight, and radioed in. Just another quiet night in the woods. Or so I thought. As I made my way down the narrow trail, the forest grew denser, the shadows longer. The chirping of insects slowly faded, replaced by an eerie silence. That's when I heard it, a low guttural sound, like an animal growling, but deeper, much deeper. It reverberated through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. I stopped, scanning the forest with my flashlight. Nothing. I shook it off. Bears weren't uncommon out here, and sometimes the forest played tricks on your ears. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of my light. As I continued along the trail, I noticed something odd. The forest, normally so alive with movement, seemed completely still. No rustling leaves, no scurrying animals. Even the wind had died down, leaving an oppressive stillness. My breath came in short, nervous gasps, though I tried to calm myself. This was my territory. I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But then I saw it, a figure standing among the trees about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a hiker who'd wandered off the trail. But as I pointed my flashlight toward it, my stomach dropped. It wasn't human. Its body was unnaturally tall and gaunt, covered in matted fur. Its head was canine, like a wolf or a dog, but its eyes, those eyes, were far too intelligent, too aware. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The creature didn't move, just stared at me, unblinking, as if it were sizing me up. I reached for my radio, but my fingers fumbled, and it fell to the ground with a dull thud. The creature's lips curled back, revealing jagged yellow teeth, and it let out a low guttural growl that shook me to my core. That's when I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at my face and arms as I tore down the trail. My flashlight bobbed wildly, casting strange, shifting shadows around me. Behind me I could hear it, heavy footfalls getting closer. Whatever that thing was, it was fast. Too fast. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out. But I kept running. Suddenly the path veered sharply to the right. Without thinking, I dove into the underbrush, hoping to throw it off my trail. I crouched low, trying to control my breathing, listening for any sign that it had followed me. The forest was deathly quiet, save for the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then I heard it again, my voice. Somewhere deep in the forest I heard my voice calling out, "Help! Over here!" It was distorted, almost mocking, but unmistakably mine. A shiver ran down my spine. No one knew I was out here except for the guys at the station, and none of them could mimic my voice like that. That's when I remembered the stories, the legends whispered around campfires about creatures that could take your form, your voice, and your skin. I'd heard them called skinwalkers. I stayed crouched in the brush, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind was racing, but the fear was overwhelming. I reached for my radio again, only to realize I had left it behind when I ran. Damn it. The sound of footsteps snapped me back to the present. They were slow, deliberate, as if whatever it was knew exactly where I was hiding. I could feel the weight of its presence nearby, lurking just out of sight. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I strained to listen, to see anything through the dense foliage, but there was nothing, just the oppressive, suffocating quiet of the woods. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, praying that it had lost interest. But then I heard the voice again. "Over here." This time it was closer. Too close. Just behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing. No figure, no creature, just the empty dark forest. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, of something unseen circling me, toying with me. Suddenly a rustling sound came from the trees above, followed by the unmistakable creak of branches bending under weight. I aimed my flashlight upward, my heart in my throat. That's when I saw it. The creature clinging to the trees like a grotesque spider, its eyes reflecting the beam of my light with a sickening intelligence. It was smiling, a cruel, knowing smile. I ran again, this time with no plan, no sense of direction, just blind panic. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it was far from that thing. After what felt like hours of running, I burst into a clearing, a small forgotten campsite I hadn't seen before. There was an old, dilapidated cabin at the edge of the clearing. Desperate, I ran toward it, hoping for some kind of shelter. I slammed the door behind me and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. The cabin was old and dusty, the air thick with decay, but at least the walls were solid. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside, for the thing to come crashing through the door. But it never did. Eventually, the adrenaline began to wear off and exhaustion took over. I must have passed out because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows of the cabin, casting long beams across the floor. I cautiously stepped outside, half expecting to see the creature waiting for me, but the clearing was empty. The forest was quiet again, almost peaceful. I made my way back to the station, shaken but alive. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said I was overworked, that I must have imagined it. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after all those years alone in the woods. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, my voice, calling to me from the forest. And every time it sounds a little closer. There are places on the map that don't exist, at least not on the maps most people use. But every now and then, you stumble upon something that was never meant to be found. It was late October when my friend Luke and I decided to go on a camping trip. We had one last weekend of good weather before the cold hit, so we figured we'd go deep into the woods, somewhere remote, just to get away. Luke had always been the adventurous type, and he was the one who suggested a place he'd heard about from an old local, a hidden trail deep in the state forest that supposedly led to an abandoned cabin. I didn't like the sound of it, abandoned cabins in the middle of nowhere. No thanks. But Luke convinced me, saying it would be an adventure, something we could laugh about later over a couple of beers. We packed up our gear and hit the road early that Saturday morning. The drive took us hours, far beyond the usual trails, deep into the woods where the trees closed in on all sides, and the road turned from pavement to dirt. Eventually we parked and started the hike. The trail wasn't marked on any map we had, but Luke swore he knew where he was going. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The woods felt wrong, like they were pressing down on us, suffocating us. There were no sounds, no birds, no wind, just this oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After about 2 hours of hiking, we found it. The cabin was smaller than I expected, nestled between 2 towering pine trees, half hidden by overgrown bushes and vines. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood was dark and rotting, the windows broken, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze that seemed to exist only in that small clearing. "See, told you it was here," Luke said, grinning as he pulled out his phone to snap a picture. I didn't respond. Something about the place gave me the creeps, but I didn't want to be the one to back out now. Luke pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the silent forest. We stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, and the interior was exactly what you'd expect from an old, forgotten cabin. There was a single room, with an ancient fireplace, a broken table, and an old iron bed frame against the far wall. But it was what we found on the floor that made my stomach turn. Scratched into the wooden floorboards in long, jagged lines were symbols, dozens of them, circles, crosses, shapes I didn't recognize. They covered every inch of the floor, overlapping each other, some old, some fresher. My gut told me they weren't just random. "What do you think this is?" Luke asked, kneeling down to get a closer look. "I don't know, but it doesn't feel right," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we should get out of here." Luke laughed it off. "Come on, man, it's just some old carvings. Probably just kids messing around." He stood up, dusting off his hands. "Let's set up camp outside. We'll check this place out more in the morning." Reluctantly, I agreed. We set up our tent about 20 yards from the cabin, and as the sun set, we started a fire, hoping it would chase away the eerie feeling that clung to the clearing. But as the darkness closed in, that feeling only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. At some point during the night, I woke up to a sound. It was soft at first, like whispering, coming from the direction of the cabin. I sat up, listening intently. The fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows around our tent. Then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like something was dragging itself across the floor inside the cabin. I nudged Luke, who was sound asleep beside me. "Luke, wake up," I hissed. "There's something in the cabin." He groaned, half awake. "It's probably just an animal." I wasn't convinced. "No, it's something else. I can hear it." He sighed and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Fine, we'll check it out." We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously made our way to the cabin. The door was still slightly open, creaking as it swayed in the light breeze. The whispering had stopped, but the air felt thick, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Luke pushed the door open wider, and we stepped inside. The room was just as we'd left it. Symbols carved into the floor, the same rotting furniture, the same eerie silence. But then I noticed something different. One of the symbols, one that I hadn't seen before, was carved deep into the floor, fresh and clean. It hadn't been there earlier. My heart started racing. "Luke, we need to go, now." But Luke wasn't listening. He was staring at the far corner of the room, his face pale, his eyes wide. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. In the shadows, huddled in the corner, was a figure, small, twisted, its back to us, rocking back and forth. It looked human, but something was horribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched too tight over bones. It was muttering something, a low, raspy chant that made my skin crawl. Luke took a step back, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is that?" The figure stopped rocking. Slowly, painfully, it turned its head toward us, and that's when I saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was torn and ragged, eyes black and sunken, mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. It let out a low, guttural growl and started crawling toward us, dragging itself across the floor, fingers scratching at the wood. We bolted. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we reached the trailhead, gasping for breath. When we finally made it back to the car, we didn't speak. We just got in and drove, leaving the cabin and whatever was in it far behind. A week later, Luke called me, his voice shaky. "I've been looking into that cabin. It wasn't just some abandoned shack. People used to go missing up there, hikers, campers. Locals said it was cursed, that anyone who stayed there wasn't meant to leave. I haven't been back in the woods since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That soft, scraping sound, like something crawling across the floor, trying to get closer." I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, cryptids, all of it, just tales to spook kids around campfires. But after what happened last year, I've learned one thing. There are places in this world that shouldn't be disturbed, and some things, once awakened, can never be forgotten. It all started when my friend Ryan convinced me to go camping in a place called Black Hollow. He'd heard about it from his uncle, some old-timer who used to be a park ranger. According to him, the place was full of untouched nature. No tourists, no campsites, just raw wilderness. The only problem was getting there. There were no official trails, and the locals avoided it like the plague. They'd give you the same warning. "Don't go to the hollow. It's not for us." But Ryan, being the thrill-seeker he was, took that as a challenge. We packed light and drove upstate, the two of us ready to spend the weekend in what Ryan called pure isolation. As we left the car and began our trek into the woods, I couldn't shake the strange looks we got from the gas station clerk when we mentioned where we were headed. He didn't say a word, just stared at us with wide eyes, almost like he wanted to warn us but knew it wouldn't matter. By late afternoon, we found ourselves at the edge of Black Hollow. The trees here were taller, darker, and twisted in ways that made them look almost sentient. The underbrush was thick, making the air feel suffocating. No birds, no rustling of animals, just silence, oppressive and endless. We hadn't even set up camp yet, but something about the place felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Ryan laughed it off, calling it the perfect spot. But I was uneasy. There was no logic behind my fear, just an instinct, a deep sense of dread gnawing at my gut. Still, we pitched the tent in a small clearing, built a fire, and sat around it as the sky darkened. It was around midnight when the first strange thing happened. We were sitting in silence, just listening to the crackling fire, when we heard it, a distant, low hum. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It wasn't wind either. It was rhythmic, pulsing through the air like a deep, mournful song. Ryan and I exchanged glances, and for the first time I saw doubt in his eyes. "Probably just the wind blowing through the trees," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. I didn't argue, but I knew it wasn't the wind. As the night wore on, the humming grew louder. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, almost like something was calling out from deep within the woods, its voice carrying on the still air. Every time it stopped, the silence that followed was even more unsettling. We tried to ignore it and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The tent felt too small, too exposed. And that's when I started hearing the whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then the words started to form, low, indistinct murmurs like several voices speaking just outside the tent. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded urgent, angry even. I nudged Ryan awake. "Do you hear that?" He sat up, rubbing his eyes. But as soon as he listened, his face went pale. He heard it too. "Someone's out there," I whispered. We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped the tent. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced once again by that unnatural silence. We shone our lights into the woods, sweeping across the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. "Let's just go back to sleep," Ryan said, though I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. "We'll head out first thing in the morning." But sleep was impossible. I lay awake, heart pounding, listening to the faint whispers as they returned, growing louder as the night dragged on. At some point I must have drifted off because when I woke up, it was early morning. Pale sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, casting eerie shadows. I felt groggy, like I hadn't slept at all. That's when I noticed Ryan wasn't next to me. I scrambled out of the tent, heart racing. The clearing was empty. No sign of him. The fire had burned down to embers and his gear was still there. But Ryan was gone. "Ryan!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the woods. Nothing, no response. I called out again, louder this time, but all I got in return was silence. That and the feeling of being watched. I grabbed my flashlight and set off into the woods, calling his name. The trees were dense, their branches forming a canopy overhead, blotting out most of the sunlight. As I ventured deeper, the hum returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Another clearing, smaller than ours, with something standing in the middle. At first I thought it was Ryan, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a figure, tall, thin, and completely still. Its back was to me, but its silhouette was wrong. Its arms were too long, its posture hunched almost like it was waiting for something. My blood ran cold as I approached cautiously, whispering Ryan's name. Then the figure turned. It wasn't human. Its face was a twisted mask of stretched skin and hollow, empty eyes. Its mouth, too wide, too long, curled into a grotesque smile. I stumbled back, tripping over roots, scrambling to get away. As I ran, I heard the humming grow louder, almost deafening now, as if it were coming from every direction. The whispers joined in, a cacophony of voices filling the air, surrounding me, chasing me. The trees seemed to shift, their branches reaching toward me like skeletal hands trying to pull me back. I don't know how I found my way back to the campsite, but when I did, I grabbed my gear, leaving Ryan's behind, and bolted for the car. The whole way, the forest felt alive, watching, waiting, the humming and whispers never far behind. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, still shaking, barely able to explain what had happened. They sent a search party out for Ryan, but they never found him. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just gone. I tried to tell them about the figure I saw, but they didn't believe me, said I was in shock, that I'd imagined it. But I know what I saw. Something was in those woods, something old, something that didn't want us there. It's been almost a year now, and I still dream about it. The figure, the humming, the whispers. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear them again, faint, distant, calling me back. But I'll never go back, because whatever's in Black Hollow, it never lets you leave, not really. I never expected to be so rattled by a simple camping trip. I'd been out in the woods countless times, but that weekend, something felt different. I'd headed up to Old Pine Ridge, a place I'd visited dozens of times, a place I knew like the back of my hand. But that time, things just didn't feel right from the moment I arrived. I got to the trailhead around noon and immediately felt the silence pressing in. There was no bird song, no distant rustle of small creatures scurrying in the underbrush. Just silence. It was unsettling, but I shook it off, thinking maybe it was just one of those days when nature was quiet. I hiked in, following a narrow, winding path that led to a small clearing where I planned to set up camp. As I walked, I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Shadows darting between the trees, quick and soundless. I stopped a few times, looking around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, towering and still, and the quiet that seemed to grow heavier with every step. When I finally reached the clearing, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the soft earth, big ones like a man's, but the strides were impossibly long. They led in a circle, stopping and starting at odd intervals. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I set up my tent and started a fire, hoping the warmth and light would chase away the unease gnawing at me. The shadows lengthened, and as night fell, the silence only deepened. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching me. Then out of the darkness I heard it, a voice low and soft calling my name. Tom. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. It sounded like my friend Jake, but that didn't make sense. Jake was hundreds of miles away, back in the city. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I'd wanted a weekend to myself. Tom, the voice called again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I was starting to feel foolish, so I sat back down, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the shadows. Tom, the voice repeated, and this time it was right behind me. I spun around, but again there was nothing, just empty space and the crackling of the fire. My skin prickled, and I knew I needed to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, tossing my things into my backpack, dousing the fire with dirt. As I was about to shoulder my pack, a figure stepped into the clearing. I nearly dropped everything, but then I recognized the ranger's uniform. Relief washed over me. "Oh, thank God," I said, forcing a laugh. "You gave me a scare. I thought I was alone out here." The ranger just stood there, staring at me, his face shadowed. He didn't say anything, just kept watching me with a strange, unsettling intensity. Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice wavering. He tilted his head like he was studying me and finally spoke. "You need to leave." "I was just about to," I replied, my heart hammering. I thought I heard something. A voice calling my name. The ranger nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "It knows your name," he said. "It knows all our names." My stomach twisted, a cold wave of fear washing over me. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his movements unnaturally fluid, almost too smooth. "There are things in these woods that wear faces, but they're not human. They'll call you, make you think you're safe, but you're not. Not anymore." I backed away, my mind racing. This had to be a prank, some kind of sick joke. But the look in the ranger's eyes told me otherwise. His gaze was empty, hollow, like he was staring right through me. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the trees, his figure blending seamlessly with the shadows. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and sprinted back to the trail, not caring about the noise I was making, just desperate to get out of there. As I ran, I heard the voice again, closer than ever, calling my name over and over. "Tom, Tom, come back." I pushed myself harder, the trees blurring past me, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I saw the trailhead, my car waiting just where I'd left it. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine, glancing back at the woods as I pulled away. And that's when I saw him, the ranger, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just him. There were others too, shadowy figures lurking in the darkness, all with hollow eyes and twisted smiles, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the forest far behind me. But I knew that those woods would never really let me go. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear that voice, soft and whispering, calling my name from somewhere just beyond the light. And I know that if I ever go back, they'll be waiting. I love camping. At least I used to. There's something about being out there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and the endless dark of the forest, that feels like freedom. Or at least, it did. Before last summer, I was on one of my usual solo trips up in the Adirondacks, a place I know like the back of my hand. It's about as deep in the woods as you can get in New York without crossing into Canada. No cell signal, no lights, just you, the trees, and whatever else is out there. That's always been the appeal for me, disconnecting. But that trip was different. That trip ruined camping for me. I remember that night so clearly, it's like I'm still there. It was just before dusk, and I'd been hiking all day, trying to reach this spot I'd found on an old map. Some place that the park rangers either didn't know about or didn't want people to know about. It was called Dead Man's Hollow. I know, pretty cliché, right? But I figured it'd be the perfect place to camp without any disturbances. The hike in was uneventful. The forest was quiet, just the sounds of leaves crunching under my boots and the occasional bird overhead. Peaceful even. I set up camp in a small clearing just as the sun dipped behind the trees, the sky turning from blue to a bruised purple. By the time I got my fire going, the woods around me were swallowed by darkness. And that's when I noticed how silent everything was. No crickets, no rustling in the underbrush, just stillness. It should have been my first warning. I was cooking a freeze-dried meal over the fire when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl. The sound came from just beyond the firelight, deep in the blackness of the trees. It sounded like a dog, but bigger, much bigger and meaner. My first thought was bear, so I grabbed the small hatchet I kept by my side and stood up slowly, scanning the woods. I called out, "Hey, go on, get." My voice sounded much smaller than I'd expected it to, like the trees were swallowing it. The growl stopped, but I could feel something watching me. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just my nerves. I sat back down, finished my meal in silence, and crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew I was waking up to the sound of laughter. It was soft, like a child trying not to be heard, and it was circling my tent. I froze. I didn't know what to do. That kind of laughter doesn't belong out there, not in the deep woods, and it was getting closer. I reached for my hatchet, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle tight, my ears straining to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It felt like hours before it stopped, the silence hitting me like a punch to the gut. And then something dragged its fingers, its claws, down the side of my tent, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. I shot out of the tent, swinging the hatchet wildly, my voice hoarse as I screamed at the empty forest. But there was nothing there, no footprints, no sign of an animal, just the dying embers of my campfire and my own panicked breaths in the cold night air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, staring into the darkness, gripping my hatchet like it was my lifeline. The forest stayed quiet, but every so often I'd hear something moving just beyond the tree line, something heavy like it was pacing, waiting for what? I didn't know. As soon as the sun broke over the horizon, I packed up and left. I kept my head down, walked fast, and didn't look back. But as I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me. I'd hear branches snap to my left, and when I'd turn, nothing was there. Then a few minutes later, it'd be on my right, and I'd catch the faintest glimpse of something, just a flash of gray fur, or maybe skin. It was hard to tell. But it was always gone before I could get a good look. I made it to my truck by noon, and I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and peeled out of there. I didn't look back, not once, but I could feel it. The eyes, watching me, following me. That should have been the end of it. I should have left whatever it was out there in the woods, and I almost convinced myself that's what happened. But about a week after I got home, things started happening around my house. I'd wake up to find scratches on my front door, long and deep, like something had tried to claw its way inside. At night, I'd hear that same low growl from outside my window, and sometimes that laughter. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But last night something changed. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the sounds outside, those same soft laughs and heavy footsteps. But then I heard my back door creak open. I locked it. I know I did. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but I couldn't get a signal. It felt like the woods all over again, like whatever had followed me had brought that deep silence with it, cutting me off from everything else. And then it spoke. A voice came from the shadows of my hallway, soft and hoarse, mimicking my own voice. Go on. Get. It was mocking me, repeating what I'd said in the woods, but distorted, like it was forcing the words through a mouth not made for human speech. And then laughter, louder this time, closer. I didn't stick around to see what it was. I ran out the front door and didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house. I banged on their door, screaming for help until they let me in. The cops came, of course, but they didn't find anything. No scratches, no open doors, nothing to prove I wasn't just crazy. I'm staying with a friend tonight, but I don't know if that'll help. Whatever it is, it followed me out of those woods, and it won't let me go. I can hear it right now outside the window, pacing, waiting, and laughing. I don't know how much longer I can keep running from it. And if you hear laughter in the woods, don't run, don't speak, and whatever you do, don't look back. I'd been itching for a break from the city, so when my buddy Mark suggested a weekend camping trip in the remote woods near Pikes Hollow, I didn't hesitate. He had mentioned the area was supposedly haunted, but I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me. I mean, who really believes in that stuff, right? Mark swore up and down that the place had seen more than its fair share of disappearances over the years, but I figured that just meant fewer tourists and more room for us. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and a faint chill clung to the breeze. As we hiked deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded, until all we could hear were our footsteps crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. After setting up camp near a small clearing, Mark and I settled in around the fire, the flames crackling and sending sparks up into the twilight. It felt good to be out here, away from the city lights, just the two of us and the endless stretch of forest around us. We spent hours talking, laughing, and cooking over the fire. But as the night grew darker, an uneasy silence settled over the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I strained my ears but heard nothing unusual, just the wind rustling through the trees. "You're just trying to freak me out," I replied, forcing a laugh, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Mark didn't answer. He just stared out into the darkness, his eyes narrowed, scanning the trees. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere just beyond the firelight. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The growl was followed by a rustling sound, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Mark. "Yeah, maybe," he replied, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew there were no bears in this area, at least not according to the park ranger we'd talked to earlier. He'd warned us about coyotes, sure, but this didn't sound like a coyote. It sounded wrong. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the circle of firelight. It was a park ranger, or at least he looked like one. His uniform was dirty and torn, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "You shouldn't be out here." Sorry, we didn't think we'd run into anyone out here," I stammered. "We, spoke to another ranger earlier, and he didn't mention any restrictions." The ranger's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being pulled into some kind of trap. His eyes were too dark, almost black, and they didn't seem to reflect the firelight. "It's not safe," he replied, a hint of something menacing in his tone. "There are things in these woods that you don't want to meet." Before we could respond, he turned and walked back into the darkness, his figure blending seamlessly with the shadows. Mark and I sat there, stunned and silent, watching until we could no longer see him. "We should leave," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Something's not right about that guy." Mark nodded, but as we started to pack up our gear, we heard another growl, this time closer, almost right behind us. We whipped around, our flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. "Let's go," Mark said, his voice shaking. We grabbed our backpacks and started back toward the trail, our footsteps quick and desperate. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something lurking in the shadows. As we reached the edge of the clearing, a loud snap echoed through the woods, and we froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I didn't know what was out there, but I could feel it watching us, waiting. Suddenly, Mark grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Let's just keep moving." We picked up the pace, practically running through the trees, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, Mark's voice, coming from somewhere off the trail. "Help, over here." I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at Mark beside me, who looked just as shocked. That sounded like you," I whispered, my heart pounding. "It's not me," Mark replied, his voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here." We broke into a full sprint, adrenaline fueling our escape, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. Every few moments I heard Mark's voice calling out from the darkness, the same words over and over. "Help! Over here!" We finally burst out of the woods, gasping for air, and stumbled back to the trailhead where we'd parked. As we fumbled with the car keys, I glanced back at the trees, half expecting to see something standing there, watching us. But there was nothing, just the empty woods, silent and still. We sped back to the nearest ranger station and reported what had happened. The ranger on duty listened quietly, his expression grim. When we finished, he took a deep breath and said, "You two are lucky. A few years back, another pair of campers disappeared in those woods. We found their camp, but we never found them. Locals say it was a skinwalker." Mark and I exchanged a glance, a shiver running down my spine. We didn't stay to ask questions. We got back in the car and drove away, leaving Pikes Hollow far behind. To this day, I can still hear that voice sometimes late at night, calling from the shadows. And I know deep down that whatever was in those woods is still out there waiting. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip, just me and the wilderness. I'd done it a dozen times before, but this time I decided to push a little deeper into the woods, away from the usual campsites, and closer to the heart of the forest where few people dared to go. The ranger I'd spoken to at the entrance seemed surprised when I told him where I was headed. "Most people stick to the marked trails," he'd said, his voice carrying a hint of warning. "But if you're set on it, just be careful. People talk about strange things out there. Things that look human, but aren't." I'd shrugged it off. People love to talk, and stories grow with every telling. Besides, I like the idea of the woods being mysterious, of a place where you could still feel alone in the world. By the time I reached the campsite I'd chosen, it was late afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of pine and moss, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and my own footsteps. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd come for. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in with a book as the sun dipped lower in the sky. As darkness closed in around me, I started to hear things, small, unidentifiable noises coming from just beyond the firelight. It wasn't unusual for animals to be active at night, but there was something about the way these sounds moved that put me on edge. It was as if whatever was out there was circling me, just out of sight. "Get it together," I muttered, poking at the fire to build it up again. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger, making my skin prickle. I'd been out here hundreds of times before, but I'd never felt like this. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard a voice, a man's voice, low and calm, coming from the darkness. "Evening," he said. I whipped around, squinting into the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The man stepped into the firelight, and I recognized the uniform immediately, a park ranger. But he didn't look quite right. His face was too pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were all wrong. They were too dark, like twin pits that seemed to swallow the firelight. "You're camping alone?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice eerily calm. Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Is there a problem?" He smiled, but it was a strange, twisted sort of smile that made my stomach churn. "Just thought I'd warn you," he said, stepping a little closer. "Strange things out here. You might see something that looks like a man, but it's not a man." I swallowed hard, instinctively taking a step back. "Is that so?" He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "The locals call it a skinwalker. Likes to mimic people, voices, sometimes even faces. You'd do well to leave before it finds you." "Thanks for the warning," I said, forcing a smile, though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run. He just stood there staring at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving me alone with only the faint crackle of the fire. I didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I kept imagining that ranger's face, his empty eyes, his twisted smile. I tried to convince myself that he was just trying to scare me, that it was all some kind of joke, but deep down I knew something was off. I could feel it. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, I heard a familiar voice calling from the darkness. "Help over here." It was the park ranger's voice, but it sounded strange, like it was stretched too thin, echoing through the trees. I froze, straining to see through the dim light, but there was nothing there. Then suddenly I heard it again, closer this time. "Help over here!" My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the voice that was wrong. It was the way it moved, like it was sliding from one place to another, getting closer each time. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack, doused the fire, and took off down the trail. The voice followed me, repeating the same words over and over, growing louder with each step. As I stumbled through the woods trying to find my way back to the main trail, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. It was the park ranger, but his body was twisted, contorted in a way that no human should ever be. His limbs were too long, his face stretched and distorted, and his eyes were nothing but black pits. I ran faster, the blood pounding in my ears, the voice still calling after me, closer and closer. "Help over here!" By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a faint light over the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see that twisted figure emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the silent trees and the empty trail. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, desperate to tell someone what had happened. But when I got there, the ranger on duty gave me a strange look. "There haven't been any rangers patrolling that area for months," he said, his brow furrowed. "You're lucky you made it out. We've had more than a few disappearances over the years. Locals say it's the Skinwalker. I didn't argue. I just got back in my car and drove, leaving those cursed woods behind. To this day, I can still hear that voice sometimes, echoing in the back of my mind. It follows me, calling from the darkness, reminding me of the thing that wears a face but isn't human. And I know that if I ever go back, it'll be waiting for me. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the city. 2 nights in a secluded part of the forest where I could reset and leave behind the stresses of work and everything else. I'd camped a lot as a kid, but it had been years since I'd been this deep into the woods, far from any signs of civilization. No signal, no crowds, just me, my tent, and the endless trees. The drive-in was rough, and the ranger I passed at the entrance seemed surprised when I told him I'd be camping alone. He gave me an odd look before saying, "Just make sure you stay on the main trails, and don't be out after dark. Things look different at night." His warning sounded like the usual advice for city folk who think they can rough it in the wild. I just smiled and thanked him, but something in his expression lingered. I hiked out to a spot recommended in a forum just off the main trail, and it seemed perfect. By the time I set up my tent, the sun was dipping low, casting the trees in eerie shades of orange and purple. I gathered wood for a fire, and as I sat there watching the flames, the forest around me grew unnaturally quiet. No wind, no crickets, not even a distant bird call. It felt like I was being watched. That first night I was just starting to fall asleep when I heard something moving outside my tent. It was heavy, each step sending small vibrations through the ground. I reached for my flashlight, clutching it like a weapon, heart racing as I strained to listen. Whatever it was right outside, breathing in slow, ragged huffs that sounded too large, too deep. I held my breath frozen, hoping it would pass. And after what felt like hours, the steps grew fainter and then stopped altogether. I told myself it was just a bear, or maybe an elk. But somehow I knew it was something else. The next morning I went looking for tracks around my tent but found nothing. No disturbed soil, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anything had been there. But as I walked back to camp, I saw something strange in the distance. A large structure like an old hunting tower loomed between the trees, partially hidden by the underbrush. I hadn't noticed it when I set up camp, and it hadn't been on the map. I decided to check it out. The tower was old, almost ancient, with beams rotting and sagging as if it would collapse at any moment. But what unnerved me the most were the symbols carved into the wood. Strange markings that seemed almost familiar yet foreign. Circles, crosses, and shapes that resembled animals but were twisted, misshapen. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were staring back at me, watching. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape slipping through the trees, too fast for me to make out any details. I shook it off as my mind playing tricks on me and hurried back to camp. The second night was worse. I'd barely fallen asleep when I was startled awake by voices. They were faint at first, but gradually grew louder, surrounding me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it, huddling deeper into my sleeping bag, but the voices grew more insistent, closer, almost frantic. They were right outside my tent, dozens of them, speaking in a low, guttural tone that seemed to pierce through my mind. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands trembling as I switched it on and shone it around the tent. Nothing. The voices stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed down on me. Then, I heard it, the sound of something scratching against the fabric of my tent. Slow, deliberate, like claws dragging across canvas. I was paralyzed, unable to move, too terrified to even breathe. The scratching continued, moving around the tent, circling, taunting, and then I heard it, a low growl, deep and rumbling, something that shouldn't have been possible for any animal I knew of. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would leave, praying I would wake up. Eventually the scratching stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight clutched in my hands, every sound sending a jolt of fear through me. The next morning I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up as quickly as I could, practically running back to the trail, every nerve on edge. But as I made my way through the forest, something caught my attention. There, just off the trail, was a figure standing between the trees, watching me. At first I thought it was a person, but as I drew closer, I saw that it was wrong. It looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, its posture too hunched, and its skin was stretched tight, almost translucent. And its face was a twisted, grotesque parody of a human, with empty sockets where eyes should be, and a mouth that hung open, too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled back, nearly falling, and as I turned to run, I heard something behind me. Another figure, and another. They were everywhere, moving through the trees, watching me with those hollow eyes, mouths stretching into grotesque smiles. I ran faster than I ever had, not daring to look back until I burst out onto the main trail. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. I looked back toward the trees, but they were gone. The forest was silent, as if it had swallowed them whole. I drove back to the ranger station, desperate to tell someone, anyone. But when I got there, the ranger wasn't the same man who had been there before. This one was older, with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. I told him everything, the creatures, the tower, the symbols, but he just looked at me, expressionless. "There's no tower out there," he said, shaking his head slowly, "and no one else has been up that way in years. Folks say the woods can play tricks on you, especially when you're alone. Sometimes it's better not to go looking for things." I left, feeling like I was losing my mind, but as I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, and there, standing on the side of the road, was the first ranger, the one who'd given me the map, only now his face was stretched, hollow, his mouth hanging open in that same too-wide grin. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. But I know I'll never go into those woods again. Whatever I saw, whatever followed me, it's still out there, waiting. And I don't know if it was the forest playing tricks on me, or if I had stumbled into something far more ancient and evil. But I do know one thing. They were watching, and now I feel like they always will be. I had planned this trip for months, a solo backpacking journey deep into the forest, a place where no trails existed, where the trees grew thick and wild. The ranger I checked in with gave me an odd look, his face pale beneath his hat. "You sure you want to go out there alone?" he asked. "Folks sometimes come back saying they saw things that don't make sense." I laughed it off, told him I'd be fine, but his warning lingered as I made my way into the forest, the sounds of civilization fading with each step. By the time I set up my tent that night, I was surrounded by an eerie silence that felt almost expectant. It wasn't until the third night that things took a turn. By then I was miles from any road, far from where anyone would look if something went wrong. It was around midnight when I heard it. A distant cry, long and mournful, like a human scream twisted into something inhuman. It echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but I'd never heard anything like it before. I lay awake for hours, listening. Eventually I heard footsteps. At first they were soft, cautious, but they grew closer, louder, until they stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. And then there was a scratching, light at first, but insistent, like something testing the fabric, looking for a way inside. I didn't dare move. I waited silent, hoping it would go away. Eventually, the scratching stopped and I heard the footsteps retreat, fading into the night. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my knife, every sense alert. The next morning I found strange tracks around my tent. They looked almost like hoof prints, but larger, deeper, with strange claw-like imprints around them. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, sizing me up. I debated heading back, but pride and curiosity kept me moving forward. I wanted to know what was out here. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I came across a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk scarred with strange symbols carved deep into the bark. They looked ancient, like something you'd see in a museum, but more unsettling, almost like they were alive. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, but I couldn't look away. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw a movement, a shadow, flitting between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs seemed to bend in ways that defied nature. I caught a glimpse of its face, a hollow, expressionless mask with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare right into my soul. My heart raced, and I backed away, desperate to put distance between myself and that thing. I set up camp as far from the clearing as I could manage, but the forest felt different now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in around me. That night I heard the crying again, closer this time. It didn't sound like an animal or a person. It was something else, something wrong. I lay in my tent, clutching my flashlight, when I heard it again, the footsteps circling me, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was playing with me. And then the crying changed. It became a laugh, low, guttural, echoing around me, coming from all directions at once. I shot up, stumbling out of my tent, my flashlight sweeping the darkness. I saw nothing but trees, shadows twisting in the light. And then I saw it, the creature, standing at the edge of the trees, its face now contorted into a grotesque smile, its eyes dark and endless. It lifted a hand, and I saw long, bony fingers extending toward me, beckoning. I ran. I don't know how far or how long, but I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed, gasping for air, my flashlight flickering as it hit the ground. When I looked up, I was surrounded, not by trees, but by figures tall and thin, their faces identical to the thing that had been stalking me. They stared down at me, their mouths stretching into unnatural grins, and I realized with horror that they had no eyes, just empty, black voids. I scrambled backward, but they didn't follow. They just watched, as if waiting for something. And then, one by one, they began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that filled the air, resonating in my bones. It grew louder and louder, until it felt like my skull would shatter. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. I could feel it inside me, twisting, reshaping. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The figures were gone, the forest silent once again. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented, desperate to find my way out. As I staggered through the trees, I caught sight of my reflection in a small stream, and my blood ran cold. My face was pale, my eyes hollow like the creatures I'd seen. I touched my skin, and it felt cold, like I was wearing a mask. I stumbled back, terrified, as I heard a familiar sound echoing through the forest, the sound of footsteps, of crying, of laughter. And then I understood. I hadn't escaped. I had become one of them. Now I wander these woods, a shadow among shadows, searching for the next lost soul to join us. And if you ever find yourself deep in the forest, far from the trail, you might just hear me. And if you do, it's already too late. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, alone this time. My friends were supposed to join me, but they had canceled at the last minute. It should have been a red flag to head back, but I figured one night out here by myself wouldn't be so bad. The solitude was almost appealing. I could use some time away from everything. The forest, known as Raven's Hollow, had an eerie reputation, but that was half the thrill. People in town whispered about strange occurrences out here, howling sounds, flickering lights, and shadows that moved on their own. They said the place was haunted, cursed even, but I didn't believe any of it. I'd always thought of myself as rational, grounded. As I set up my tent, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to blanket the entire forest. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off, lighting a fire and settling in for the night with a book and some snacks. The quietness started to gnaw at me. I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there, scanning the shadows that seemed to deepen as night fully set in. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides, making the trees loom larger and more menacing than they should have. It was around midnight when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on dead leaves coming from somewhere behind my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out, hoping it was just another camper or maybe a lost hiker. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then, slowly, deliberately, they started again, circling around my camp. I strained my eyes, but the firelight barely penetrated the darkness beyond the immediate circle of my campsite. My flashlight was in the tent, and I cursed myself for not keeping it close. Just then, a figure stepped into the light. I nearly screamed. He was wearing a park ranger's uniform, but it looked ancient, the fabric worn and torn in places, as if it had been left out to rot for years. His face was shadowed by his hat, and I couldn't make out his features, just the glint of his eyes as he looked at me. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. I stammered, trying to explain that I was camping and didn't mean any harm. His face was expressionless, a hollow mask as he listened. Then he nodded, almost to himself, and looked out into the woods. "You should leave," he said flatly. "This isn't a place for the living." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, as if listening to something just beyond my hearing. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I noticed something off about them. They were too bright, too reflective, like the eyes of a predator. He took a step back and then, without a word, melted into the darkness. I waited, breathless, expecting him to come back, but he was gone, leaving only the quiet and the lingering sense of something watching me. I packed up my things, deciding I'd had enough of Raven's Hollow, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. Footprints, large and deep, circling my campsite. They were inhuman, almost like a wolf's, but bigger, with claw marks that gouged deep into the earth. I followed them with my eyes, and they disappeared into the trees. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, more deliberate. I turned, and there he was, the ranger, standing just at the edge of the firelight. But his form was different, twisted somehow, like his bones had rearranged beneath his skin. His face was shifting, flickering, as if it couldn't hold its shape. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. He took a step forward, and his face morphed, stretching and contorting until it looked like mine. I was staring at myself, at a grotesque, hollow-eyed version of me, grinning with a mouth too wide, filled with teeth that didn't belong. "You should leave," it repeated in my voice, that same mocking, hollow tone. I turned and ran, stumbling through the trees, the footsteps following, mirroring my own. The darkness seemed to thicken, closing in on me, the shadows twisting into forms that seemed almost human, almost familiar. They whispered my name, their voices blending together into a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself inside and slammed the door, barely able to fumble the keys into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back, expecting to see him, or it, standing there, grinning. But there was nothing, just the trees, tall and silent, and the empty winding road beyond. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached the edge of town, my heart still racing, my skin cold with sweat. I tried to tell myself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by too much isolation and too many ghost stories. But when I got home, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and the breath froze in my lungs. Because the face looking back wasn't mine. It was hollow, expressionless, with eyes that glinted too bright, too reflective. It smiled, that same wide, too full smile, and I knew that whatever had been in those woods had followed me, and I don't think it's ever going to leave. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to escape the noise, to lose myself in the deep, untamed woods. The park ranger at the entrance smiled as he handed me a map, marking the trail with a dirt-caked finger. "Be safe out there," he said, eyes narrowing in a way that should have warned me to turn back right then and there. I brushed it off as the usual spiel. I was wrong. He knew. The first night, Everything was fine. My tent was pitched beside a little stream, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to block out all sound, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I let myself relax, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by an eerie, distant howl. It was far off, almost human, but just wrong. I told myself it was just a coyote, maybe a wolf. But deep down, I felt an unnatural chill that kept me from drifting back to sleep. The next day, I explored deeper into the forest. It felt different, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The birds were silent, the air thick and still. I kept thinking I saw movement just at the edge of my vision. Shadows flitting between trees, vanishing as soon as I tried to focus on them. That evening, as I prepared a small fire, I noticed something strange. I could have sworn I saw footprints in the soft earth around my camp. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, almost like a man's but distorted, with claws extending from each toe. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was a bear, but I knew better. I'd seen bear tracks before. These were different. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing noises, whispers that sounded almost human, but came from somewhere high up, like something was watching me from the treetops. Then came the scratching, long, slow drags of claws against the bark. Whatever was out there, it wasn't shy. At dawn, I packed up and started back toward the main trail. The forest was denser than I remembered, the underbrush thicker, almost as if it were trying to keep me in. My skin prickled with every step, a sense of being hunted weighing down on me. As I pushed through a thicket, I stumbled into a clearing and froze. There, not 50 feet from me, stood something that defied explanation. It looked like a man, but its limbs were stretched impossibly long, its joints twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin was as pale as bone, stretched taut over an emaciated frame, and its face, God, its face was almost human, but its eyes were hollow, empty pits, and its mouth was too wide, too full of teeth that glistened even in the dim light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature cocked its head as if studying me before it opened its mouth and let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through my bones. And then, as if on cue, the woods came alive. The air filled with shrieks, growls, and snapping branches, all closing in around me. I ran, tearing through the forest, branches clawing at my skin like desperate hands trying to drag me back. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I burst into another clearing, this one littered with shredded clothing and scattered bones, bleached white and gnawed. I recognized some of the clothing, a ranger's hat, the same one I'd seen on the man who'd handed me the map. I stumbled back, barely holding down the bile rising in my throat, when I heard it again. The howling. Closer this time. It sounded almost like words, garbled and twisted but unmistakable. It was calling my name. I looked up and there it was again, the same creature, but this time it wasn't alone. Flanking it were others, each more twisted and monstrous than the last. One looked like a grotesque blend of a dog and a man, its face elongated into a snout, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence. Another was hunched, almost spider-like, with limbs that bent in ways that made my skin crawl. They closed in around me, circling like vultures, their eyes never leaving mine. I felt a cold rush of realization. I was prey. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on them, until my foot caught on something. I looked down and saw a weathered backpack, the initials RT, scrawled in fading ink. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My brother, Rick, had gone missing in these woods years ago, and the search had turned up nothing. I had come here to find closure, to let go. But now, surrounded by these creatures, I understood the horrible truth. He hadn't disappeared. He'd been taken. I glanced back up, and the creatures were even closer, their twisted faces mere feet from mine. I took a step back, preparing to bolt, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see one of the creatures, but instead it was the ranger. His face was drawn and pale, his eyes hollow and lifeless, as if he were a puppet being controlled. "Welcome home," he rasped, his mouth curving into a sickening grin. And then I noticed the familiar shape of his hand, long, skeletal, with fingers that stretched too far, just like the creatures around him. The ranger wasn't a man, he'd never been a man. With dawning horror, I realized that the creatures weren't hunting me. They were waiting for me to join them. I was never leaving these woods. They would twist me, mold me, make me into one of their own. And so I ran, knowing it was hopeless, knowing I would never escape. The howling followed me, taunting me, until I tripped and fell, the creatures descending upon me like shadows. As they closed in, the last thing I heard was my own voice, twisted and echoed back at me, distorted and hollow. "Welcome home." They found my backpack months later, the initials barely visible under layers of mud and rot. They'll call it another disappearance, another lost hiker in the woods. But the truth is, I'm still here, watching, waiting. And someday they'll find someone else to take my place. Because in these woods there is no escape. There is only the hunt, the terror, and the twisted, endless dark.